When I stepped into the courtroom, my daughter's face curled into a smirk, and my son-in-law dismissed me with a slow shake of his head. I had on my plain country clothes, boots worn down to nothing, and a battered wool cap in my hands. Everything about me said lost farmer, a bewildered old man with no idea where he'd ended up. I caught Lynette leaning toward Clifton, murmuring something, and he flashed that cold, self-satisfied grin he'd always worn like a badge. Then came her laugh, strangled, barely contained, and it hit me square in the chest. That's what I was to them. A joke, a nuisance, some doddering fool who had wandered into a room that didn't belong to him. Then the judge raised his eyes from the bench. They found mine. The color left his face all at once, his hand going unsteady against the wooden gavel. His mouth formed words, barely a breath, and whatever he said stopped every sound in that room cold. "My God," he said. "Is it really him?" Every head swiveled toward me. The quiet pressed in so hard I could hear my own pulse. Lynette's smirk vanished. Clifton just stared at the judge, brow furrowed, like the man had gone suddenly mad. Neither of them had the first clue who they were really dealing with. Not yet. My name is Garrison Whitmore. I am 70 years old, and I am still carrying the damage my own family did to me. Welcome back to Dad Revenge. I'm glad you found your way here today. If this channel has ever given you a story worth sitting with, go ahead and tap that subscribe button so the next one comes straight to you. Before we get into it, tell me, what are you up to right now while you listen? Driving somewhere, cooking dinner, taking a quiet rest? Drop it in the comments. I always love knowing who's on the other end of this. Now, a quick note, some elements of this story have been shaped for audio storytelling, and any resemblance to specific real people or events is purely coincidental. What matters is the truth inside the tale. It all began 3 months ago, on what should have been an ordinary quiet Thursday at my secluded farm just outside of Roanoke, Virginia. Since my beloved wife Nadine passed away 2 years ago, that farm had become my whole world. A peaceful refuge from city noise, somewhere I could work the garden, look after the chickens, and sit out on the porch, turning over all those good decades Nadine and I had shared together. I had happily handed off the tangled financial responsibilities to my son-in-law Clifton. He was a sharp, fast-talking venture capitalist who'd married my daughter Lynette 10 years ago. I trusted them completely. They were my blood, my family. That afternoon, I walked the long dirt driveway out to the mailbox. Buried among grocery flyers and seed catalogs was a thick envelope stamped in bright red urgent. It was from the county tax assessor. I tore it open expecting routine paperwork. Instead, the bold black letters across the top of the page made the air leave my lungs. Final notice of default property tax delinquency, imminent foreclosure warning. Standing there in the driveway, the autumn wind cut through me like it had gone cold overnight. I read every word 3 times. The document stated my property taxes were 90 days past due, and if the outstanding balance wasn't settled by month's end, the county would move to seize the farm. My farm. The home where Nadine and I had meant to live out our last years together. None of it made any sense. Exactly 1 month earlier, I had wired $35,000 straight into Clifton's account for the sole purpose of covering those taxes. He'd told me over a family dinner that it was all handled, that I shouldn't be burdening my retired mind with wire transfers and paperwork. I pulled out my phone right there in the driveway and called Lynette. My hands weren't shaking from age. They were shaking from a hard, sudden jolt of adrenaline. She picked up on the 4th ring, her voice layered over the clatter of some upscale restaurant lunch crowd. "Hello, Dad. I'm in the middle of a meeting. Can I call you back?" "Oh, Lynette, I need to understand why I just received a foreclosure warning from the county tax assessor," I said, holding my voice steady. I handed Clifton the money for those taxes 4 weeks ago. What is happening? A long pause followed. The background noise seemed to fade. Dad, calm down, she said, her tone taking on that patronizing sweetness people use on frightened children. Clifton handled that. You probably got a delayed automated letter. Don't worry about it. We'll come by tonight and get it sorted. Just rest. They pulled up just after sunset. The headlights from Clifton's gleaming silver luxury SUV swept across the porch where I sat waiting. Clifton climbed out first in an expensive tailored suit, looking utterly at ease. Lynette followed, clutching a structured leather tote, her face carrying an expression of weary, put-upon patience. I led them to the living room and set the final default notice flat on the coffee table. Walk me through this, Clifton, I said, putting my finger on the bold red ink. He didn't so much as reach for the paper. He just exhaled, unbuttoned his jacket, and settled back into my sofa like a man without a care in the world. Garrison, you're getting worked up over nothing, he said evenly. I paid those taxes weeks ago. The county office is notoriously slow updating their records. You know how government offices run. But this letter was printed 3 days ago, I said, tapping the date at the top. It states explicitly, no payment received. If you paid it, show me the bank confirmation right now. Clifton and Lynette traded a quick, loaded look. It said, everything here comes the confused old man again. Dad, stop interrogating him. Lynette cut in, stepping forward and resting a perfectly manicured hand on Clifton's shoulder. He's doing you a favor by managing your finances. You've been forgetting things constantly. You're confused. I am not confused, Lynette. I am reading a legal document. You are confused, Dad, she repeated, lifting her voice just enough to own the room, her eyes pinned on mine, flat and unyielding. Do you have any idea how bad your memory has gotten? Last week you couldn't remember the name of my new dog. 2 days ago you called me just to ask what day it was. And yesterday... She paused, drawing a slow, trembling breath. Yesterday we stopped by while you were napping and found the gas stove running. The whole kitchen reeked. You could have blown the entire house apart and died. Dad, we had to shut it off and throw open every window. The room went completely still. The only sound was the ticking of the old mantel clock in the hallway. I looked at my daughter and felt something solid drop away beneath my feet. The gas stove. For just a fraction of a second, my mind wavered. I could almost conjure the smell. I could picture the warmth of that kitchen, Nadine standing right at that stove humming along to old country records, while she tended her famous Sunday pot, roasts the scent of thyme and bay leaf soaking into every wall, turning this hollow house into something that felt like a home. But when Nadine lost her fight 2 years ago, the music quit. The cooking quit. I glanced toward the kitchen doorway. I had not touched that gas stove in exactly 2 years. I'd been living off cold sandwiches, microwave meals, and coffee from an electric maker. Months back, I'd even shut off the main gas valve behind the appliance because there was simply no reason to use it. It was physically impossible that I had left the stove burning the day before. A cold, clarifying dread moved through me. I wasn't losing my mind. My own daughter was looking me dead in the eye and lying. Why? Why would she invent a story about me nearly destroying the house? Why was Clifton so completely unbothered about a missing $30,000? I studied their faces. Lynette was playing the part of the devoted, exhausted daughter without a single false note. Clifton was performing the long-suffering, misunderstood son-in-law. Had I been just an ordinary grieving old farmer, I'd have crumbled right there. I'd have apologized for my fading memory, surrendered my independence, and handed them everything. But they had overlooked one critical fact about who I am. Before this farm, before the chickens and the quiet life, I spent 30 years as a federal prosecutor. I had looked straight into the eyes of the most ruthless, manipulative white-collar criminals on the eastern seaboard. I knew precisely what a lie looked like. I recognized the small, involuntary tells of someone cornered in a deception. And I was watching those exact same tells play out right now on the faces of my own family. Every instinct I had screamed at me to throw them out, demand my money back, drag the truth into the open. But the old prosecutor in me came forward, cold, measured, and patient. If I confronted them now with nothing solid in hand, they'd only sharpen their story. They'd hold up my anger as fresh proof of my supposed mental decline. To come out ahead in this, I had to play along. Let them think they'd already won. I let my shoulders cave inward. I let my hands tremble a little more than they needed to. I dropped my gaze to the floor, putting on the posture of a man beaten down and lost. I left the stove on, I murmured, letting my voice fracture just enough. Yes, Dad, Lynette said, her manner softening immediately into that saccharine warmth. It terrified us. You're getting older. The grief is catching up to you. You can't carry all this stress anymore. I gave a slow nod, eyes down, so she couldn't see the fury burning behind them. You might be right, I whispered. I'm just so tired. Clifton rose and buttoned his jacket with a satisfied smirk. Don't give that tax notice another thought, Garrison. I'll ring the county assessor Monday morning and clear up their error. You focus on getting some rest. We'll handle everything from here. They walked out the front door and left me alone in the quiet farmhouse. I stood at the window and watched their vehicle fade into the darkness down the road. Whatever grief had been sitting in my chest burned off, replaced by something cold and purposeful. They believed they had a helpless old man waiting out his days. They believed they could rob me blind and manipulate me straight into an institution. But they had just roused something they were not ready for. The hunt had officially begun. The very next morning, before the sun had cleared the hills, Lynette was back at the farm. She came into my kitchen carrying a small, unmarked amber prescription bottle and set it on the granite counter beside my coffee maker with that same soft, practiced smile. Dad, I spoke with Dr. Oberg this morning, she said, reaching for the coffee pot to pour me a cup. He agrees with Clifton and me. The grief, the isolation, it's taking a toll on your cognitive functions. He prescribed these vitamins to support your memory and keep you sharp. I stared at the little amber bottle. Innocent looking enough, just a plastic cylinder packed with small white capsules. But a voice deep in the back of my skull, an old, worn-in, deeply cynical voice that had cross-examined mob bosses and embezzlers without blinking, quietly, told me don't swallow them. I knew better than to ignore that instinct. It had carried me through decades of courtrooms without once letting me down. But this was my daughter. The little girl I'd steadied on a bicycle seat. The teenager I'd watched drive away to college with a trunk full of hope. The woman I'd walked down the aisle to marry Clifton. How could I let my prosecutor's suspicious brain turn on my own child over a forgotten burner? I talked myself down. The foreclosure notice had my nerves frayed, that was all. I needed to lean on my family, not suspect them. So I twisted off the cap, shook out a capsule, and washed it down with my coffee. Lynette smiled wide, kissed my cheek, grabbed her coat, and headed back to the city. She told me she'd text every morning to make sure I was keeping up with the medication. And wanting peace in the family, I did as I was told. Within exactly 2 weeks, my grip on reality began coming apart. It crept in gently, at first a dense, persistent heaviness behind my eyes, a muddy fog that had fully settled over my thinking by mid-morning. I used to rise easily at 5 each day to work the vegetable garden and read through the financial papers. By the end of that first week on the pills, dragging myself out of bed before 10 sonors felt like a battle I was losing. My legs moved like they'd been filled with wet sand. Every single step cost me something. I'd sit on the edge of the mattress, gulping for air like a man going under. Then the tremors arrived. I first noticed them when I reached out to sign a delivery receipt for chicken feed. My hand shook so hard the pen clattered off the porch before I could finish. The delivery driver stared at me with the kind of deep, uncomfortable pity you reserve for an animal that isn't going to make it. My stomach turned at that look. By the second week, the fog had become something solid. Clear thoughts would take shape in my mind and simply dissolve into static before I could find words for them. I caught myself standing in front of the living room wall for hours with no memory of what I'd meant to be doing. The same legal mind that had spent 30 years outmaneuvering the country's most cunning criminals was being ground into nothing. I felt like a man sealed inside a body that was shutting down room by room. Every memory of Nadine, every thread of the life we'd built together, felt like it was behind glass, visible but untouchable. Yet even through the thick lethargy, one thought kept punching through: the tax default notice. Clifton had promised to call the county and sort out the error. He'd given me his word that the $35,000 was exactly where it was supposed to be, but the doubt had taken hold. I had to see it myself. I needed to pull up my bank statements and follow that wire transfer with my own eyes. One quiet afternoon, I sat down at the kitchen table and dragged the laptop in front of me. My fingers hovered over the keys, rattling against my will. I tried to type the bank's web address, but my vision kept blurring, making the letters slide around on the screen. 3 attempts just to reach the login page. The bright display stared back at me like it was enjoying this. I wiped sweat from my forehead, clicked the username field, got that much in, then moved to the password box. The cursor blinked. My mind emptied out completely. I pressed my eyes shut and dug at my temples, ordering my brain to produce something. I had used this same password for 5 years. It was built from Nadine's maiden name, and the year we were married, a combination I could have rattled off in my sleep. But when I reached for it now, the drawer was bare. Nothing but white noise. Panic climbed up through my chest. My breathing went tight and fast. I typed in what I believed was the password. Incorrect. I tried a variation, maybe a capital letter was off. Incorrect. My hands were shaking badly enough that I kept misfiring on the keys. I pressed enter a third time. A red warning box filled the screen. Your account has been temporarily locked due to multiple failed login attempts. Please contact customer service. I pushed the laptop away, my heart slamming against my ribs. I snatched my cell phone from the table, thumbs fumbling across the screen to reach the bank's customer line. The automated system asked me to enter my account number. I fished out my debit card and keyed in all 16 digits. Then please enter your 4-digit telephone security PIN to speak with a representative. I went rigid. The phone against my ear felt like cold metal. 4 digits. 4 numbers. I had known this PIN like I knew my own reflection. But standing there in my kitchen staring at the wall, the numbers simply weren't there anymore. The medication had thrown up a wall between me and my own memory. So please enter your 4-digit telephone security PIN, the voice repeated. Come on, Garrison, I muttered under my breath. Think. Just think. I punched in a sequence the year I was sworn in as a federal prosecutor. I held my breath and waited. I'm sorry that PIN is incorrect. You have 2 attempts remaining. Cold sweat broke out across my forehead. The room shifted slightly. The weight from the morning pill was dragging at me, urging me back to bed, urging me to let it go. But the fear of losing my grip on everything kept my feet planted. I entered another set of numbers. Nadine's birth month and day. I'm sorry that PIN is incorrect. You have one attempt remaining before your account is frozen for your protection. I lowered the phone from my ear. My chest heaved. I looked down at my shaking hands. They looked like a stranger's hands, not the hands that had once driven legal briefs onto courtroom tables and demanded accountability. They looked feeble. I felt feeble. I ended the call and set the phone down on the table. The silence of the farmhouse came down on me like a weight. I dropped into a chair and pressed my trembling face into my hands. It was the first time since Nadine died that I felt genuinely terrified. I was locked out of my own accounts. I had no means of confirming whether Clifton had taken my $35,000. I had no way to verify if the foreclosure threat was real. And worst of all, I was losing the one thing I had left to fight with my own mind. Lynette and Clifton had looked me square in the face and told me these pills would clear my head. They had promised they were helping me. But sitting there shaking, unable to summon 4 simple digits, a razor-sharp clarity cut right through the haze, they weren't trying to heal me. They were trying to hollow me out. The days that followed were a grinding cycle of stolen lucidity and chemical exhaustion. I knew the pills were poisoning me, but I also knew that if I quit them cold, Lynette and Clifton would understand immediately that I'd seen through them. I had to hold the performance together. I kept accepting the pills whenever Lynette was watching, then palming them and tucking them into my pocket. But enough of the drug was already woven into my system to keep my hands unsteady and my thoughts dragging through heavy sludge. They came back on a Sunday carrying an expensive box of pastries from downtown Roanoke. Lynette swept through the front door with her usual manufactured brightness, calling out to ask how her favorite father was getting on. Clifton came in behind her, already checking his watch, wearing his impatience like a second coat. I was at the kitchen counter trying to pour myself a cup of black coffee. The heavy cast-iron mug felt like it weighed 50 pounds. "Here, let me help you with that, Dad," Lynette said, moving toward me with a look of performed concern arranged carefully across her face. "I can do it," I muttered, pitching my voice to sound unsteady. I wrapped my hand around the mug and lifted it. My arm shook hard. Dark coffee sloshed over the rim and scalded my knuckles. I tried to hold on, but the tremors had full control. The mug slipped free and smashed onto the hardwood floor, sending hot liquid and broken shards spraying across the room. "Oh, for heaven's sake," Clifton said, heavily stepping inside. "I'm sorry," I whispered at once, dropping to my knees. I swept blindly at the broken pieces, letting my hands shake even more than they already were. Head down, playing the part of the pitiful, broken old farmer they were so eager to see. "Don't cut yourself, Dad," Lynette said, her voice dipped in counterfeit sympathy. "Just leave it. I'll get the mop." She headed off toward the utility closet down the hall. I stayed on the floor, carefully closing my fingers around a sharp shard. From where I knelt, I had a direct sightline to the large sliding glass door that opened onto the back patio. The morning sun was striking the glass at just the right angle, turning it into a dark, flawless mirror. I studied what it showed me. Clifton was standing behind me, propped against the kitchen island. He wasn't looking at me with any trace of worry or compassion. His face wore a sneer of raw, undisguised contempt, cold-eyed, calculating, impatient. Lynette came back in from the hall carrying the mop, paused beside her husband, and looked down at me as I fumbled with the fragments on the floor. Clifton tilted toward her ear. His voice was little more than a hiss, but the kitchen was quiet enough to carry every word straight to me. "Oh, he's practically useless now," Clifton murmured, his gaze fixed on my trembling back. It won't be long. Lynette didn't correct him. She didn't say a word in her father's defense. She gave one short, silent nod and handed him a paper towel. As I watched their reflection, something settled inside me, vast and still. The chemical fog that had been smothering my mind for weeks burned off in a single flash of cold fury. The trembling in my hands stopped entirely. I crouched there on the floor, gripping the broken shard, and let the full weight of his words work their way into my bones. He is practically useless now. In that instant, the image of the weak widower shattered. That particular look of arrogant contempt on Clifton's face threw a switch somewhere deep in my brain, one that hadn't been touched in years. It was the same expression I used to see on Wall Street fraudsters right before I took them apart 30 years ago. I'd sat across polished conference tables from men exactly like Clifton. Men who believed their smooth talk made them invincible. Men who were certain they could loot the innocent work the system and stroll away untouched. They all kept smiling. Right up to the moment I laid irrefutable evidence before a judge and watched every drop of blood leave their faces. For 30 years, I was the most dangerous presence in those courtrooms. I built cases so airtight that defense attorneys told their clients to take the plea rather than step in front of me. When Nadine died, I folded that version of myself away. I traded tailored suits for flannel and legal briefs for a garden trowel. I wanted stillness. I wanted to be left alone. But watching Clifton stand in my own kitchen and map out my destruction, alongside my daughter, I understood that stepping away had been a mistake. I wasn't a sick old man. I was a target, and the people hunting me were amateurs. They thought they'd found a soft mark, a fat bank account attached to a dimming mind. They thought they could sedate me into surrender, strip away my property, and park me in a cheap facility somewhere to disappear quietly. They had made a catastrophic miscalculation. I drew a slow, measured breath and let the ice-cold focus of my old career move through me like a current. The prosecutor was fully awake, and he was hungry. I knew precisely what came next. No confrontation, not yet. I needed evidence. A paper trail. A case so airtight and so devastating that neither of them would ever find their footing again. I exhaled a ragged, defeated-sounding sigh and let the trembling reclaim my hands. I dropped the shard and hauled myself slowly off the floor, putting my weight heavily against the counter. "I'm so sorry, Lynette," I stammered, pitching my voice to quiver convincingly. "I just can't seem to hold on to anything today. My hands simply won't cooperate." Lynette patted my arm, her manufactured smile back in position. "It's okay, Dad. That's what we're here for, to take care of you. Go sit in your recliner and rest. I'll clean this up." I nodded with practiced meekness and shuffled toward the living room, dragging my feet the way a heavily medicated man would. I folded myself into my old leather armchair and closed my eyes as if the short walk had spent me completely. In reality, my mind was moving at full speed. Every detail of the room, every word exchanged, every financial transaction I could reconstruct was being sorted and filed. I tracked the sound of Lynette mopping the kitchen floor and Clifton tapping at his phone. They felt safe. They genuinely believed the hard work of their scheme was behind them. They had no idea the real contest had only just started. The battle lines had been drawn in spilled coffee on my kitchen floor, and I intended to be the last one standing when it was over. The following morning unfolded exactly as it had for the previous 2 weeks. Lynette called at 8 to make sure I was up and to remind me about my medication. I kept my voice thin and rough, telling her the bottle was already in my hand. I unscrewed the cap, shook out one of the small white capsules, and carried it to the bathroom. I held my own gaze in the mirror. My eyes were red-rimmed, my skin washed out and pale. I dropped the pill into the toilet and flushed it. I watched the water swirl it away, and with it went the last remnant of faith I had in my daughter. Over the next 48 hours, I ran the same routine. Morning and evening, each pill went down the drain. The withdrawal punished me. Deep muscle cramps twisted through my body, and unrelenting headaches hammered behind my eyes as the chemical residue worked its way out. But by the third morning, the curtain lifted. My thoughts sharpened back into focus. The fog dissolved and the calculating mind of a federal prosecutor came back online completely. My hands were steady as I poured my black coffee. I was back. But Lynette and Clifton could not know that. Every time they called or came by, I kept the act running, the trembling hands, the sentences that faded to nothing. I still needed to know what had been inside those capsules. Going to my regular physician in Roanoke was out of the question. Lynette was listed as my emergency contact and held medical proxy rights on my file. Any toxicology request placed locally would fire off a notification straight to her phone. I had to go somewhere they couldn't track. I left my vehicle, the one fitted with GPS, and walked to the barn instead. Under a tarp sat my old farm truck from the 90s. I grabbed the keys, set the amber pill bottle on the passenger seat, and turned the key. The engine caught with a deep, rattling growl. I drove 50 miles out on unpaved back roads until I found a rural clinic tucked between two farm towns. The waiting room was empty. I stepped up to the front desk and paid $300 in cash for a confidential consultation, registering under a variation of my middle name. The attending physician was a tired-looking man with gray hair who seemed genuinely startled to have an elderly walk-in requesting toxicology work. I climbed onto the examination table, held out the small white capsule along with a $50 bill to move things along, and told him I needed to know exactly what compounds were inside that pill and a blood panel to show what toxins were still circulating through me. He turned the capsule over in his gloved hands with a frown, but the cash and my tone didn't leave him much room to push back. He confirmed I'd have results by the following afternoon. I thanked him, walked back out to the truck, and started the long drive home. The adrenaline from the errand kept my mind sharp and alive. I spent the whole return trip cataloging my next legal moves, working out how to dismantle Clifton's financial web as the back roads unspooled ahead of me. I turned the reality of it all over in my mind. I had given my career to putting criminals away. Decades spent breaking down financial fraud, weighing testimony and shielding vulnerable people from exactly the kind of predatory scheme my own family was running against me now. The sheer nerve of it was breathtaking. They had convinced themselves that because I was a grieving widower, I had forgotten how to fight. They had mistaken my age for vulnerability. I held the steering wheel in a firm grip, a cold wave of clarity moving through me. I wasn't simply going to stop them. I was going to take their entire operation apart, piece by piece, and leave them with nothing. Absorbed in the planning, I'd lost all track of time. I dropped my eyes to the dashboard clock. Nearly noon. Lynette always rang the kitchen landline on her lunch break to check on my condition. No answer, and she would panic. Panic meant she'd send Clifton out to the farm to see what was wrong. They would figure out I was clear-headed, capable, and running an investigation right under their noses. I pressed my boot hard into the gas. The old truck shuddered as it pushed past the speed limit, eating up the rural highway. Pine trees streaked past the windows in a green blur. My grip on the wheel tightened until my knuckles went white. I ran the numbers: distance left, time remaining. It was going to be very close. I swung hard onto my dirt driveway, sending a wall of dust billowing up behind the tires. Before the truck had even rolled to a stop behind the barn, I heard it, the landline ringing, the sound carrying clear through the kitchen window. I cut the engine, shoved the door open, and ran across the yard. Another ring. That was the fifth. One more, and she'd hang up and assume the worst. I wrenched open the screen door, covered the kitchen floor in 3 strides, and yanked the receiver off the wall mount just as the 6th ring started. I held it against my chest for 1 second, steadied myself, let out a slow breath, then lifted it to my ear. "Hello," I said, keeping my voice thin and unsteady. "Dad." Lynette's voice hit like a slap through the speaker. I was 2 seconds from calling Clifton and sending him over there. "Is everything okay?" "I'm sorry, sweetheart," I mumbled, forcing a vague, confused little laugh. I was out on the porch. Took me a minute to even remember where the ringing was coming from. My legs are so heavy today. "I think the medicine is making me drowsy," she exhaled. The edge left her voice, and the synthetic warmth flooded back in. "Oh, Dad, you have to be careful. Don't push yourself. The vitamins are doing their job helping your brain heal." "Did you take your morning dose?" I glanced at the empty amber bottle sitting in my pocket. "Yes, Lynette," I said softly, staring at the kitchen wall. "I took it exactly like you told me to. I'm following all your instructions." "Good," she said. "Clifton and I will come by this weekend to check on things. Just stay in the house, Dad. We'll handle everything from here." I set the receiver down slowly and let the mask fall away entirely. I straightened up in the center of that quiet kitchen, breathing evenly, my old mind sharp and fully engaged. The trap was laid. The greedy hunters had no idea they were already walking into it. The phone rang again just after 2, the following afternoon. I let it go 3 times before picking up, making sure my breathing was steady and even. It was the doctor from the rural clinic, right on schedule. He skipped any pleasantries. His voice carried a tight professional gravity that put me on alert from the first word. He asked whether I was sitting down. I told him I was standing, but that my head was completely clear, and I was ready to hear whatever he had. He told me the blood panel and the chemical analysis of the capsule had produced deeply troubling results. The pills my daughter had given me were not vitamins. They contained no trace whatsoever of any dietary supplement. What they contained was a concentrated generic formulation of a potent antipsychotic medication, a drug designed specifically for severe cases of acute schizophrenia and violent psychotic episodes. The dosage packed into those capsules was dangerously high for any patient, and especially so for a man my age. He explained that introducing heavy neuroleptics into a healthy brain would rapidly produce symptoms that mirrored the advanced stages of severe dementia. It shuts the nervous system down. It generates artificial tremors, profound disorientation, blocked memory retrieval, and a crushing lethargy that effectively locks a person inside their own deteriorating body. He warned that extended exposure could cause permanent neurological damage or trigger a fatal cardiac event. He strongly urged me to contact law enforcement right away and offered to forward his lab findings directly to the local police. I thanked him for his thoroughness, declined his offer to bring in the police just yet, and asked him to mail a certified hard copy of his report to a private post office box I kept under a separate name. I hung up the phone. The kitchen fell into a ringing silence. My own daughter, my own blood had been poisoning me in a methodical, deliberate campaign. She had smiled into my face, kissed me on the cheek, and pressed the very chemical shackles into my hand that were meant to drag me into a padded room. The betrayal was so complete, so deeply evil, that it moved beyond anger entirely. It hardened into something cold and unbreakable, pure, tactical resolve. I knew Lynette was tied up with a corporate media launch that afternoon, which meant Clifton would be handling the daily welfare check in her place. He pulled up to the farm just before 5-owner gravel popping under the heavy tires of his gleaming silver luxury SUV. I watched him from the kitchen window. He stepped out, straightening his tailored cashmere overcoat, scanning my property with the appraising eye of a developer looking over a vacant lot he was already planning to flip. He climbed the porch steps without knocking and let himself in with the spare key I had been foolish enough to hand over years ago. I shuffled quickly to the living room, caved my shoulders inward, and let a heavy tremor settle into my hands. I sat staring at the cold, unlit fireplace with my mouth hanging slightly open, playing the sedated old man without a flaw. Clifton came into the room and stopped a few feet from my chair. No greeting, no inquiry about how I was feeling. He simply stood there, pulling a slim leather notebook from his breast pocket and writing something down. "Garrison," he said, his voice raised and condescending. "Did you take your afternoon dose? Lynette said you sounded a bit off on the phone yesterday. We need to make sure you're keeping up with your regimen." I turned my head toward him, slowly blinking several times, as though struggling to bring him into focus. "Yes," I murmured, letting my voice break. "I took them. But my head feels so heavy today, Clifton. Everything keeps spinning." He let out a short, irritated sigh, the sound of a man annoyed simply by my continued existence. "Well, the doctor said it takes time for your brain chemistry to normalize. Just sit quietly and let the medication do its work." As he spoke, his hand went into the right pocket of his overcoat to pull out his ringing phone. When he drew it out, the fabric pulled back just far enough for a brief glint of metal to catch the afternoon light. A small, distinctively shaped brass key on a heavy silver ring. I knew it at once. It was the master key to the heavy floor safe behind the false paneling in my study. A month ago, when I'd first noticed it gone from my nightstand, Lynette had spent an entire hour helping me comb through the house for it. She had taken my hands in hers, looked straight into my eyes, and told me gently that my memory was slipping, that I must have misplaced it during one of my foggy spells. She had taken my own missing property and used it as the first brick in her wall of lies. And the entire time that key had been sitting in her husband's pocket. I needed it back. If they were getting into that safe, they had access to the original property deeds, the bearer bonds, and the entire legal architecture of my estate. I had to recover it right then, but I couldn't simply demand it. Confronting him would tell him the dementia was an act. I was going to have to steal it. Back in the late 80s, I had led a sweeping federal takedown of a sprawling, organized crime network operating across the eastern seaboard. To build my case, I had leaned heavily on a street-level informant named Sal, a gifted pickpocket, who had agreed to turn state's evidence. During the long hours we'd spent together in the safe house, Sal had walked me through the mechanics of the lift. He'd explained that a successful theft wasn't about speed. It was about misdirection. You had to generate a physical jolt, a sudden, overwhelming point of contact that flooded the target's senses and made them completely blind to what your hands were quietly doing. Never in my wildest imaginings did I picture myself running a street thug's con on my own son-in-law right there in my living room. I gripped both armrests and began hauling myself upright. I made sure my legs trembled convincingly. "Clifton," I gasped. "I need water." He rolled his eyes and took a step my way. "Just sit down, Garrison. I'll get it from the kitchen." The moment he reached out to push me back into the chair, I made my move. I let my eyes drift back in their sockets. I drained every ounce of tension from my knees, executing a flawless imitation of a sudden massive fainting spell. My full dead weight pitched forward straight into Clifton. He grunted in shock, his phone tumbling from his grip onto the carpet as he reflexively threw both arms around my torso to keep me from hitting the floor. His hands locked onto my shoulders, every shred of his attention swallowed by the physical burden of my collapsing body. The sudden shock overloaded him completely. In that precise instant, while he was wholly occupied with keeping us both upright, my right hand glided smoothly and silently into the open pocket of his wool coat. My fingers found the cold metal of the brass key. I pinched it between my index and middle finger and drew it out in one fluid, practiced motion. Without a beat, I tucked it into the waistband of my trousers and pulled my sweater down to cover it. Start to finish, the whole extraction took under 2 seconds. "What in the world is wrong with you?" he snapped, wrestling my heavy frame back toward the leather armchair. "Stand up, Garrison. Come on, sit back down." I let him steer me into the seat. I sagged against the cushions and released a long, ragged breath, blinking hard, as if I were just clawing my way back to consciousness. "I'm sorry," I whispered faintly. The room just went completely black. I felt so dizzy. Clifton dusted off his expensive coat with an expression of pure revulsion. He crouched to retrieve his fallen phone, entirely unaware that his pocket was now lighter. "This is exactly why you can't be left alone anymore," he muttered, thumbing a rapid message on his screen. "You're becoming a massive liability. I'll get you a glass of tap water, then I have to go. I've got a business meeting." He turned his back and headed for the kitchen. The instant he disappeared from view, I reached into my waistband and pulled out the brass key. The metal sat heavy and cold in my palm. I closed my fist around it, feeling the sharp edges bite into my skin. This was not merely a piece of metal. It was the key to my survival. It was the proof that they were already inside my vault, picking my life apart from the inside out. Clifton came back and shoved a glass of water onto the side table. "Drink that and stay put," he ordered. "Lynette will call you tonight." I nodded slowly, keeping both hands folded in my lap, the stolen key hidden beneath them. "Thank you, Clifton," I murmured. "You are a good son." He sneered, spun on his heel, and walked out the front door. I listened to his gleaming, silver luxury SUV fire up and crunch down the gravel drive. I didn't move a muscle until the sound of the engine faded entirely into the distance. Then I sat up straight. The tremors vanished. The weakness evaporated. I looked down at the brass key lying in my open palm. The rage that had been quietly smoldering in my chest hardened into something clean and cold, pure, unadulterated purpose. They had poisoned my body. They had insulted my intelligence. Now they were plundering my vault. The time for hiding was finished. It was time to strike back. Every piece of evidence I collected from this point forward would be another nail driven into their proverbial coffins. I was not going to simply survive this assault on my life. I was going to tear down their fraudulent reality just as ruthlessly as they had tried to erase mine. I waited until the sun sank below the tree line and the farm was swallowed in complete darkness. I knew better than to touch the landline or my regular cell phone. If Clifton and Lynette were brazen enough to drug me and steal the key to my safe, they were more than capable of monitoring my call logs. On my afternoon visit to the rural clinic, I had bought a cheap prepaid phone with a fistful of cash. I pulled the little plastic device from my boot, powered it on, and dialed a number I had carried in my head for over 20 years. The line rang twice before a deep, gravelly voice picked up. It was Conrad Holloway. Conrad was a titan in the world of civil law, a man who moved through courtrooms with a surgeon's precision and a shark's ruthlessness. We had squared off against each other many times during my years as a federal prosecutor. Over time, that professional rivalry had mellowed into a deep, unspoken mutual respect. He was the only soul I trusted with a secret of this magnitude. "Conrad," I said, keeping my voice low. "It's Garrison Whitmore. I'm on an unregistered phone. Don't call me back at my regular number. A brief pause. Garrison. Conrad replied, his tone shifting in an instant from casual to strictly business. Nobody buys a burner phone to talk about the weather. What's going on? I laid out the facts with the clinical detachment of a man reading an indictment into the record. I walked him through the property tax default notice. I told him about the antipsychotic drugs my own daughter had disguised as vitamins. I described Clifton stealing the key to my hidden floor safe. I offered no emotional commentary. I presented the evidence, nothing more. I reminded him that if this effort failed, I stood to lose everything I had built: my land, my estate, my freedom. He promised he would move heaven and earth to prevent that outcome. Conrad held his silence for a long moment after I finished. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a quiet, terrifying anger. They're setting you up for a fraudulent conservatorship, Garrison. Their aim is to establish your medical incompetence so they can seize your assets. We need to document their actions right now. I need eyes inside my own house, I told him. I need them to catch Clifton opening that safe. But it has to be completely off the books. No licensed security firms, no paper trail they can follow. I keep a private technical team, Conrad assured me. Former federal surveillance specialists who work exclusively for my firm. They're discreet and they're fast. I'll dispatch them to Garrison's farm tonight. Leave the back door unlocked. The hours before midnight crawled past with agonizing slowness. I sat in the darkened living room and watched faint moonlight press through the curtains. I ran through every possible legal scenario in my mind. I was no longer a father trying to make sense of his child's behavior. I was an investigator building a trap. At precisely midnight, 2 unmarked dark sedans rolled silently up my dirt driveway with their headlights extinguished. 3 men in dark, nondescript clothing slipped out of the vehicles and moved quickly toward my back porch. They wore gloves to leave no prints and carried specialized gear bags that looked entirely ordinary from the outside. I unlatched the heavy wooden door and let them in. They asked no questions. They offered no pleasantries. They simply went to work with a brand of quiet professionalism that put me at ease instantly. The lead technician, a tall man with sharp, watchful eyes, handed me a secure tablet and explained that they'd be installing military-grade micro cameras directly into the architectural molding of the living room and the study. The lenses were no bigger than a pinhead, completely invisible to the naked eye. The encrypted video feeds would upload directly to a secure server at Conrad's law firm. If Clifton or Lynette set foot in this house, every movement, every whispered word would be captured and preserved as irrefutable legal evidence. I directed them to the study first. I pointed out the heavy oak bookshelves lining the far wall. The floor safe lay concealed beneath a false section of hardwood directly under the bottom shelf. The technicians nodded and set about drilling microscopic holes into the crown molding near the ceiling. They worked with surgical precision, threading hair-thin wires behind the drywall. I watched them in the dim glow of a desk lamp, gripped by a strange mixture of relief and deep sorrow. I was converting my own sanctuary into an active surveillance operation to catch my daughter committing a felony. The weight of that reality pressed hard against my chest, but I pushed the feeling aside. This was a war of survival. Every second ticked loudly in my ears, a reminder that we were working inside a dangerously exposed window of time. If Clifton had decided to swing back for another unannounced check, the entire operation would be blown wide open. The installation, however, turned out to be far more complicated than anyone had anticipated. The thick, century-old plaster and dense oak beams of my farmhouse fought their modern tools at every turn. What was supposed to be a quick 45-minute job stretched into 90 minutes. The study was fully wired, and now the team was fanning out into the main living room to set up a secondary camera angle. The lead technician signaled they needed another 30 minutes to tuck the power transmitter behind the fireplace mantel. I stood watch at the front window, my gaze locked on the long, dark ribbon of road that led up to my property. It was exactly 1:45 in the morning when the silent alarm triggered. A small blue light pulsed on the digital monitor I kept beside the front door. That monitor was tied to a motion sensor I'd put in at the mouth of my driveway years back to track delivery trucks. Somebody had just turned onto my land. A cold knot tightened in my gut. My breath came faster as the full weight of what that meant settled over me. The entire operation was hanging by a hair-thin thread. The tech team had live wiring stretched across the center of the living room floor. The heavy mantelpiece was partially pulled from the wall. Tools were scattered all over the rug. I pressed the button on the monitor to bring up the gate camera's live feed. A gleaming silver luxury SUV was creeping up the driveway, moving slow enough to keep the gravel quiet. The license plate was unmistakable. It was Lynette. She was coming to check on me. My mind raced through her possible reasons. Why would she make that drive all the way out here at nearly 2 in the morning? The answer landed like a fist to the chest. The evening dose. I had flushed my nighttime pill hours ago, but I hadn't sent her a text confirming I'd taken it. I'd been so consumed with coordinating Conrad and the surveillance team that I'd let the illusion of compliance slip. Lynette, obsessed with keeping my system flooded with those antipsychotic drugs, had driven out to the farm in the dead of night to force the pill down my throat herself. I already knew she was ruthless, but making that drive at 2:00 in the morning laid bare just how deeply she was committed to this dark scheme. The stakes were absolute life and death. I spun around to face the technicians. "We've got a vehicle coming in," I whispered sharply, my voice cutting across the silent room. "You have exactly 2 minutes before she reaches the front door." The 3 men moved without hesitation. They started rolling up exposed wiring and jamming equipment into their black duffel bags. But the living room was a disaster. Thick white plaster dust from the drilling sat in stark, glaring contrast against the dark, polished hardwood floor. The mantelpiece was still visibly out of alignment. There was no possible way they could pack their gear, scrub the evidence, and get out of the house before Lynette spotted the disruption. The bright headlights of her SUV swept across the front windows, throwing long, terrible shadows up the living room walls. I heard the crunch of tires as she brought the vehicle to a stop directly behind the tech team's unmarked sedans. She would see those cars. She would see the dust. She would understand that a trap was being laid, and the entire prosecution would collapse before I could file so much as a single document. I had to buy them time. I needed a distraction so overwhelming, so alarming, that she would stop thinking about the unfamiliar cars, stop noticing the dust on the floor, and fix every ounce of her attention on me. I looked at the lead technician. "Go out the back window," I said quietly. "Don't stop moving until you hit the tree line. I'll handle her and give you the minutes you need." The heavy slam of a car door rang out through the cold night air. The click of her expensive heels began to strike the stone walkway up to the porch in a steady, rhythmic beat. I had 10 seconds. I had to become the broken, helpless old man she believed she had manufactured, and I had to do it right there outside before she ever touched the knob of my front door. I threw open the heavy oak door and stepped out onto the porch. The freezing night air hit my bare skin like a slap. I had on nothing but thin cotton pajamas, and the temperature had plunged well below freezing. The cold was immediate and brutal, but I welcomed it. It made everything that followed genuine. I began shaking violently, my teeth chattering as I stumbled down the wooden steps and out onto the frozen gravel of the driveway. I wrapped both arms around my chest, hunched my shoulders, and began wandering aimlessly toward the blinding glare of her headlights. I stretched my eyes wide and pressed a look of hollow, absolute terror onto my face. I let my jaw hang loose. I needed to look like a man whose mind had completely come apart from reality. I had to be a man drifting blindly through a shattered memory, afraid of shadows lost in his own front yard. Lynette killed the engine and slammed her door. I heard the sharp bite of her boots on the gravel as she came toward me. Even in the darkness, I could read the fury in the way she carried herself. "What on earth are you doing out here, Garrison?" she snapped, not even bothering to say the word Dad. Her voice was hard and cold with irritation, not a trace of any parental concern. "Get back inside this instant. Are you trying to catch pneumonia?" I didn't look at her directly. Instead, I stared past her shoulder into the dark woods and lifted a trembling hand, pointing at nothing. "Nadine," I wailed, letting my voice fracture with pathetic desperation. "Nadine, is that you? Where have you been? I've been looking everywhere." "I can't find the keys, Nadine. The house is so cold." Lynette stopped dead in her tracks. The sheer scale of my apparent delusion caught her completely off guard. She stood there, staring at me, shivering in the frost, barefoot on the jagged stones, crying out for a woman who had been in the ground for years. I lurched forward, reaching out into the empty air, grasping at ghosts. I could practically watch the calculations shifting behind her eyes. The irritation curdled into something else, a twisted, victorious satisfaction. She genuinely believed her poison pills had finally tipped me over the edge into full-blown dementia. She stepped in and seized my arm at the bicep. Her grip was surprisingly strong, her fingernails biting through the thin fabric of my pajamas. "Stop this nonsense," she commanded, hauling me toward the porch. "Nadine is dead. You are confused. Move your feet." I resisted. I planted my bare feet in the freezing gravel and let my body go completely slack, making her bear my full weight. "No, no," I pleaded, shaking my head in a frantic, broken rhythm. "I have to wait for her. She was coming right back. Don't make me go inside. It's not safe in there. The shadows are moving. I'm frightened." I dragged out the struggle, pulling against her, stumbling over the stones, doing everything in my power to keep us outside in that freezing air. Every second I stalled was another second the surveillance team had to secure their gear, wipe away the plaster dust, and disappear into the forest. Lynette groaned in frustration, straining to hold my heavy frame upright. She dug her heels into the dirt and cursed under her breath. "Get up, you foolish old man!" she growled, the loving daughter mask dropping away entirely. "You are going to ruin everything if you die of exposure out here in the yard. Stand up." I let my knees buckle again, scraping my shins along the icy driveway. I moaned in manufactured agony, clawing at her tailored cashmere overcoat, like a frightened child reaching for something solid. "Please," I sobbed, pressing my face against her sleeve. "They're watching me in there. What? The men in the walls are watching me. I can't go back inside." The bitter irony of those words wasn't lost on me, but to Lynette they were just one more symptom of deep, psychotic paranoia. She wrenched her arm away, repulsed by my touch. You are hallucinating, Garrison. There is no one in the walls. There is no one here but you and me. Now walk." I dragged my feet, forcing her to haul me inch by inch up the wooden steps. I counted the seconds silently in my head. 10, 20, 30. I needed to give Conrad's team absolute certainty. I deliberately caught my foot on the top step and went down hard onto the wooden deck of the porch. I lay there face down, gasping, letting the bitter cold sink deep into my bones. Lynette kicked my left leg, a sharp, shockingly cruel motion that said everything that needed saying about the true darkness inside her. So I said, "Get up," she hissed, dropping her face down close to mine. "You are not going to ruin my plans tonight. You are going to go inside. You are going to take your medication and you are going to sleep." I pushed myself up onto my hands and knees, whimpering softly. Right now, Garrison is holding himself together by a thread performing weakness, while something enormous is closing in around him. What he is about to discover will cost him more than he imagined and change everything that comes next. Here is what I want to ask you if you suspected someone close to you was working against you in the dark. Would you confront them the moment you knew, or would you stay quiet and let the proof build? I let her grab the collar of my pajama shirt and haul me upright. We lurched through the front door and half fell into the main hallway. The warmth of the house rolled over me, but I kept right on shaking. I sank down against the wall, drew my knees to my chest, and rocked back and forth. Lynette stood above me, breathing hard from the effort. She smoothed down her expensive coat and fixed me with a stare of pure contempt. She didn't immediately turn toward the living room. Every bit of her focus was locked on managing the pitiful wretch huddled at her feet. I stole a quick, careful glance down the hall. The living room sat in perfect darkness. The heavy power tools were gone. The sliding door was pulled shut. The thick coating of white plaster dust had been hurriedly swept away. The tech team had dissolved into the night like smoke. "Stay right there," she ordered, spinning on her heel and heading for the kitchen. "Don't move a single muscle." I heard her open the glass cabinets and run cold tap water into a small plastic cup. She came back with the water and a white capsule. "You missed your nighttime dose," she said flatly, crouching down to my level. She pressed the pill against my lips. "Open your mouth and swallow this right now." I whimpered, but parted my lips obediently. I set the pill on my tongue, took a long swallow of water, and went through the full motion of gulping it down, making certain she watched my throat work. She studied me closely, holding her position for a full minute to be sure I hadn't palmed it. What she didn't know was that I'd already tucked the capsule behind my cheek. Satisfied, Lynette rose to her feet, regarded me with disgust, and left. The moment her car pulled away, I spat the pill out. I looked up at the crown molding. A tiny red light blinked once. The cameras were live. The silent hunt for their ultimate destruction had officially begun. The following morning arrived beneath a heavy gray overcast that matched the cold resolve settling into my bones. I sat alone at the kitchen island, a steaming mug of black coffee sitting untouched beside the encrypted tablet Conrad had provided. My hands were perfectly steady. The house was quiet except for the rhythmic ticking of the old mantel clock in the hallway. I powered on the tablet and entered the layered sequence of passcodes Conrad had instructed me to use. The screen came alive, splitting into multiple high-definition grids. The image quality was striking. Every corner of my living room, every shadow in my study, all of it captured through microscopic lenses the naked eye would never find. I fished the burner phone from my pocket and dialed Conrad. He picked up on the first ring, his voice sharp and businesslike. "We have secure feeds," Conrad said. "No sign of interference. My forensic accounting team is monitoring the stream from our dedicated server. We're waiting for your son-in-law to make his move." I didn't have to wait long. At exactly 2:00 in the afternoon, the crunch of gravel announced a vehicle. I was in my bedroom, deliberately leaving the main areas of the house vacant. I'd sent Lynette a text an hour earlier claiming I was feeling dangerously weak and planned to sleep through the afternoon on my medication. She had almost certainly passed that along to Clifton, handing him exactly the window he needed. I kept my eyes on the tablet screen. The front door opened with a soft click. Clifton stepped into the hallway. He moved with the practiced, predatory care of a man who had done this before, placing each foot lightly on the hardwood to keep the old boards from creaking. He stopped at the base of the staircase, head tilted, listening for any movement from my bedroom. Convinced the heavy antipsychotics had me under, he turned and walked straight into the study. The camera embedded in the crown molding caught his face in clean, precise detail. There was no hesitation in his movements whatsoever. He knew exactly where he was going and exactly what he was after. I watched jaw tight as the man who had married my daughter moved around my heavy mahogany desk. He dropped to one knee on the antique kilim rug, peeling the heavy woven fabric back to expose the bare floorboards beneath. He ran his fingers along the wood's edge, found the hidden latch, and lifted the false panel clear. The thick steel door of my floor safe came into view. He reached into his pocket and produced the brass key. The very same key I had lifted from him, had perfectly copied at a local hardware store, and had quietly slipped back into his coat pocket during a feigned stumble the evening before. He fitted the copied key into the lock, turned it hard, and swung the heavy door open. A sickening wave of violation moved through me as I watched his hands reach into my private vault. He drew out thick manila folders holding the original deeds to the farm, the property lines, surveys, the bearer bonds, and the full outlines of my financial portfolios. He spread the documents across my desk, like a man laying out a feast. He pulled a sleek smartphone from his jacket and activated the camera. For the next 20 minutes, the high-definition feed recorded Clifton methodically photographing every single page. Account numbers, routing codes, signature baselines, legal descriptions of every asset, he captured all of it. He was assembling a complete digital copy of my entire estate. I watched him carefully return each folder to the safe lock. The steel door set the floorboard back in place and roll the rug into its exact original position. He left the house as silently as he had come. When the screen finally showed an empty room, Conrad's voice came through the burner phone. It carried a weight I hadn't heard from him before. "Garrison, we have a serious problem," Conrad said, all professional distance gone from his tone. "Chica, I put my best forensic accountants onto Clifton yesterday morning. I had them dig into his venture capital firm, tear through his public filings, and map out exactly what his finances look like." "What did they find?" I asked, my voice dangerously calm. "It's a sham, Garrison. The entire firm is a hollow shell company. He hasn't made a profitable investment in over 4 years. He's been hemorrhaging money, surviving on credit, and rolling loans to keep up the appearance of a thriving corporate life. But it runs deeper than being broke. He owes money, a staggering amount of it." "How much?" I demanded. $15 million. Conrad replied, the figure hanging between us like something with weight and mass. "And he doesn't owe it to conventional banks. He owes it to a shadow banking syndicate operating out of Chicago. These are not people who send collection letters. Garrison, these are violent, ruthless creditors who specialize in high-interest, off-the-books lending to desperate executives. Clifton is backed completely into a corner, and his clock is running out." I stared at the tablet's blank screen as the pieces snapped into alignment. The fake vitamins, the isolated farm, the stolen documents. "He's using my estate," I said aloud, the cold truth of it settling over me. "That's exactly right," Conrad confirmed. "He's leveraging your assets as collateral to keep the syndicate at bay. He needed those photographs of your deeds and financial portfolios to demonstrate to these people that he has access to real capital. We found newly registered holding companies in Delaware. He has already forged your signature on multiple loan guarantee documents. Now he is pledging the farm, your investments, and everything Nadine left behind to save his own skin. If he defaults on this shadow debt, the syndicate won't just come for him. They'll come for the farm. They'll seize your property through fraudulent liens. And because he's building a paper trail of your mental incompetence, Any court would simply assume you signed the assets away in a state of confusion. The sheer, cold brilliance of their scheme left me momentarily without breath. Lynette and Clifton were not merely greedy children circling an inheritance. They were cornered criminals using my life as a shield against a violent cartel. They were methodically dismantling my mind with chemical restraints, so I would have nothing left to fight with when the syndicate came for the farm. Every warm smile Lynette had given me, every cup of coffee she had set in front of me, had been a calculated step toward delivering my legacy into the hands of violent men. I looked around my kitchen and thought of Nadine. We had built this life together with our own hands. We had poured our blood and sweat into this land. The thought of losing it to a Chicago crime syndicate because of my son-in-law's reckless arrogance set something alight inside me that burned hotter than any case I had ever taken to trial. The fire in my chest was unlike anything I had known in my 30 years as a federal prosecutor. I sat at the kitchen island staring at the encrypted tablet, while the weight of Conrad's words settled over the quiet room. 15 million. A shadow banking syndicate. My own daughter and her husband were perfectly willing to hand violent criminals my farm, my home, and everything I had built just to paper over their own reckless greed. They were keeping me sedated and compliant while they signed my life out from under me. I closed the connection with Conrad and powered down the tablet. I knew I could bring the camera footage to law enforcement right then and have them both arrested for elder abuse, but that wasn't enough. If I moved too soon, Clifton would claim he was simply organizing my paperwork for my own benefit. Lynette would weep before a judge and paint herself as a devoted daughter struggling to care for a father in severe cognitive decline. They'd retain expensive defense attorneys and construct a story about a tragic family misunderstanding. I needed them to cross a line they could never walk back from. I needed them to attempt an act of fraud so blatant, so undeniable, that the hidden lenses would catch every second of it. I had to force their hand. And to do that, I needed to manufacture a ticking clock. I had to threaten the one thing they desperately needed to satisfy the Chicago syndicate, the farm. I called Lynette. I deliberately kept my breathing shallow to make my voice sound weak. When she answered, her tone was clipped and impatient, the sound of a woman pulled away from something more important. I asked if she could come by the house that afternoon. I told her I was having a rare good day, a brief window where the fog had lifted, and that I needed to talk through something critical about the future of the estate. I caught the hesitation in her voice, followed by the familiar calculating shift in her tone. She promised she'd be there by 4:00. I spent the next 2 hours laying out my performance. I brewed a pot of coffee and poured it straight down the sink, leaving an empty mug on the table. I roughed up my hair, left my flannel shirt collar undone, and pulled a heavy wool blanket across my knees as I settled into the leather armchair in the living room. I positioned myself squarely within the optimal viewing angle of the micro camera Conrad's team had embedded in the crown molding. I was the bait, and I was sitting dead center in the trap. At 4:00, Lynette's vehicle crunched up the driveway. She came through the front door moments later carrying a reusable tote bag filled with cheap soup cans, a sad little prop meant to signal her devotion as a caregiver. She set the bag on the counter and moved into the living room, stopping a few feet from my chair. She looked at me with a blend of irritation and performed sympathy. "You said you were having a clear day, Dad," she said, her eyes sweeping the room to confirm we were alone. "You sounded quite serious on the phone. What's going on?" I looked up at her, keeping my hands perfectly still to sell the impression of temporary lucidity. I let my eyes fill with tears, drawing on the genuine grief I felt over her betrayal. "Lynette." I began letting my voice break with manufactured sorrow. "I know what's happening to me. I know my mind is slipping away. The fog grows thicker every single day. Before long, I won't remember my own name, let alone the legacy we built on this land. I drew a slow, unsteady breath. She moved a step closer, her posture going rigid. She was plainly trying to read whether this was a genuine moment of clarity or another effect of the heavy antipsychotics she had been feeding me. "Oh, Dad, don't speak like that," she murmured, reaching out to pat my shoulder with a cold, uncertain hand. "The vitamins are helping. You just need more time." "No, Lynette," I said gently, drawing my shoulder back from her touch. "We both know the truth. I'm losing this battle. But today, right now, my thoughts are clear. And I understand that I have a responsibility to protect this property before I am gone entirely. I can't let this farm fall apart while I sit in a nursing home. I can't leave you and Clifton burdened with the upkeep of an estate this size." She went completely still. Her hand hung suspended in the air between us. I watched the color drain slowly from her face, leaving her complexion pale and waxy. "What are you saying, Dad?" she asked, her voice dropping to a sharp, frightened whisper. I looked straight into her eyes and delivered the blow with precision. "I'm saying that I called my estate lawyer this morning," I said smoothly. "I've asked him to draft the final paperwork. This coming Monday at exactly 9 in the morning, I am signing the entire farm, the house, and all the surrounding acreage over to the state agricultural charity. They will preserve the land in your mother's name permanently. It's the only way to shield the property from developers and taxes. The estate will be gone, Lynette, but it will serve a purpose worth honoring." Lynette stared at me as though I had driven a blade straight through her. Her breathing went rapid and shallow. The polished, condescending mask she wore so effortlessly cracked wide open. She needed this property to keep the violent syndicate from Clifton's throat. Without the farm as collateral, Clifton was finished, and the life she had built on his borrowed illusions would cave in on top of her. "But Monday," she stammered, eyes stretched wide with undisguised panic. "Dad, you can't do that." "You're not thinking clearly. You can't just give away the family inheritance on an impulse. Clifton and I have plans for this place. You have to cancel that meeting." I shook my head slowly and let a quiet, resigned smile settle on my lips. "No, sweetheart," I whispered. "My mind is made up. The lawyer is filing the documents Monday morning. Once my signature is on that paper, the transfer is irrevocable. It will be done." She took 2 steps backward, physically staggered by the finality of what I'd said. Her hands had begun to tremble with the very tremors she'd been working so hard to induce in me. She snatched her structured leather tote from the sofa, unable to pull a coherent sentence together. "I have to go," she gasped, pivoting toward the hallway. "I'll be right back." She nearly ran out the front door, slamming it hard behind her. I listened to the frantic roar of her engine as she tore down the driveway. The clock was ticking loudly now. I had given them exactly 48 hours before the estate slipped beyond their reach. They could not afford to wait. They would have to strike this weekend. The bait was swallowed, and the predators were charging straight into my trap. Friday morning arrived with a deceptive stillness. The heavy clouds that had pressed down for days had finally broken apart, letting pale, thin sunlight wash over the frost-covered pastures. I woke at 5:00, my mind clearer than it had been in months. The last chemical traces of the antipsychotics had cleared my bloodstream entirely. I sat at the kitchen table with a hot cup of black coffee and opened the encrypted tablet to review the overnight surveillance footage. The trap was perfectly set. I had a final meeting scheduled with Conrad Holloway that afternoon to hand over the digital evidence, the toxicology reports, and the recorded footage of Clifton breaking into my safe. We were going to file a sweeping federal injunction freezing every asset and setting a criminal fraud investigation into motion before the day was out. A deep, resonant sense of vindication settled over me. I had outmaneuvered them. I was the veteran prosecutor who had walked the arrogant amateurs straight into a fatal legal ambush. But I had badly underestimated the terrifying speed of a desperate man with nothing left to lose. At exactly 8:15, the quiet of the morning was torn apart by the hard crunch of heavy tires chewing up my gravel driveway. Not one vehicle, a convoy. I crossed to the kitchen window and pulled back the curtain. My blood ran cold. 3 county sheriff cruisers sat at sharp angles across my front lawn, their light bars throwing blue and red against the morning frost. Behind them, a sterile white passenger van, bearing the seal of the Department of Social Services, sat squarely across the main exit, blocking it off. Doors slammed in unison. Uniformed deputies climbed out, adjusting their utility belts, moving with the measured, wary tension of officers arriving at a volatile scene. 2 individuals in plain civilian clothes, a man and a woman each carrying a thick clipboard, stepped out of the white van and fell in alongside the deputies. I stood frozen at the sink. My entire federal case, my meticulously assembled counterattack, was still sitting in an encrypted file on the kitchen island. I had played the bait too convincingly. I had set a ticking clock on Clifton and Lynette, expecting them to try forcing my signature on a new deed over the weekend. Instead, they had gone around me entirely. They had turned the legal system itself into a weapon and launched a preemptive strike with terrifying efficiency. Heavy, authoritative knocks hammered against my front door. The sound rang through the farmhouse like rifle shots. I drew a slow breath, forcing my racing pulse to steady. The facade had to hold. I roughed up my hair, rounded my shoulders, and shuffled toward the foyer, letting my hands shake with a visible, violent tremor. I threw the deadbolt and pulled the door open. A tall, stern-faced sheriff's deputy stood on the porch, the 2 social workers flanking him on either side. "Garrison Whitmore?" the deputy asked, his tone leaving no room for discussion. "Yes," I stammered, pushing my voice toward weak and bewildered. "What's happening here? Is there some kind of problem?" The female social worker stepped forward, her expression a practiced mask of clinical sympathy. "Mr. Whitmore, my name is Carla. We're here from Adult Protective Services. We have an emergency court order concerning your immediate welfare and the management of your estate." She held out a thick stack of stapled legal documents. The heavy black text on the first page hit me like a blow to the sternum. It was an emergency ex parte conservatorship order signed and stamped by a county judge mere hours ago. An ex parte order meant it had been filed and granted in secret, without my knowledge, without my presence, without any opportunity for me to stand before a courtroom and answer for myself. It is a legal instrument reserved strictly for the most extreme, life-threatening cases of mental collapse. I stared at the paperwork, letting my hands tremble hard enough to rattle the pages. "This can't be right," I whispered, gazing blankly at the deputy. "I'm fine. I'm perfectly fine. I only just got up to have my coffee." "I'm sorry, sir," the deputy said, his hand resting carefully on his service belt. "The judge has temporarily stripped you of your legal autonomy. You are no longer permitted to make financial or medical decisions for yourself, and you may not remain on this property without supervision. We're here to escort you to a secure medical facility for a mandatory psychiatric evaluation." Before I could pull together any kind of response, another vehicle came tearing up the driveway. Clifton's gleaming silver luxury SUV. He hit the brakes hard, threw it into park, and jumped out, striding toward the porch, with Lynette right behind him. Lynette was crying, pressing a tissue to her face, playing the shattered, heartbroken daughter with flawless conviction. Clifton pushed past the deputies and fixed me with a look of sickening, manufactured grief. "Oh, Dad!" Lynette sobbed, reaching out to seize my arm. "I'm so sorry it had to come to this. We tried so hard to look after you at home, but you're slipping away too quickly. We had to protect you from yourself." I looked at her, then dropped my gaze to the documents quivering in my hands. The attached exhibits laid out the full, horrifying architecture of their scheme. Clifton hadn't only used his shadow syndicate connections for loans. He had used them to procure forged medical records, signed affidavits from 2 private out-of-state neurologists who had never laid eyes on me, testifying that I was in the grip of aggressive late-stage chemical dementia. The documents cataloged the precise symptoms that the antipsychotic drugs had artificially imposed on my body. The severe tremors, the lethargy, the fits of paranoid agitation, the wandering out into the freezing cold night. They had turned my own survival tactics against me. Every symptom I had performed to shield my investigation had been quietly feeding their legal case for my institutionalization. Lynette had recorded my late-night wanderings and my confused, rambling behavior. She had laid it all before a judge as tragic proof that I was wholly incapable of managing a multi-million-dollar estate. I had told her I was signing the farm over to charity on Monday, and she had responded by legally erasing my existence on Friday morning. "Please, you have to listen to me," I begged, spinning toward the social worker, my voice dropping to a desperate, frantic plea. "They're lying to you. They've been poisoning me." Carla sighed and offered a sad, patronizing smile. "We're aware of the medication situation, Mr. Whitmore. Your daughter explained that you've been refusing your prescribed treatments and concealing your pills. That's why you're experiencing these severe paranoid delusions. It's a common symptom of your condition. We're simply going to get you the help you need." Clifton smirked with open triumph as the deputies steered me toward the waiting van. I dropped my chin to my chest, hiding the faint smile pulling at my lips. They had missed the burner phone in my pocket. The cold morning air cut straight through my thin cotton pajamas as the 2 deputies guided me across the frost-covered gravel toward the back of the transport van. Their grip on my arms was firm without being brutal. They genuinely believed they were managing a frail, demented old man, not a seasoned federal prosecutor. Before they let me step up into the vehicle, the taller deputy ran a standard pat-down. He worked through my pockets with practiced efficiency and came up with my regular smartphone and my heavy ring of house keys. He handed both directly to Carla, who placed them into a plastic evidence bag with solemn care. They were officially confiscating my life. But the deputy never found the deep interior pocket of my heavy wool cardigan. That was where the small, prepaid burner phone sat pressed quietly against my chest. It was my last remaining lifeline to Conrad and to the truth. I stood at the open doors of the van and put on a masterful show of manufactured confusion. I let my lower lip tremble. I gazed back at the farmhouse, my eyes drifting aimlessly, as though I couldn't make sense of any of it. Lynette was on the porch, staging a performance that nearly matched my own. She was weeping openly, her face buried in a crumpled tissue, while Clifton stood beside her, playing the steadfast, grieving husband. Carla moved toward them with a look of professional compassion and laid a reassuring hand on Lynette's shoulder, telling my daughter that the facility would keep me safe and that the conservatorship would protect my assets from my deteriorating mind. It was a nauseating thing to watch. Lynette nodded, bravely dabbed a manufactured tear from her cheek, and asked Carla if she could have one final moment to say goodbye to her father. Carla smiled softly and stepped aside, motioning for Lynette to approach the van. The deputies eased their grip on my arms, giving us the brief illusion of family privacy. Lynette descended the wooden porch steps and crossed the gravel drive toward me. From any distance, her face was a portrait of pure devastation. But as she drew close, the sorrow evaporated from her eyes, replaced by an icy, triumphant gleam. She moved into my space and wrapped both arms tightly around my neck in what appeared to onlookers to be a desperate, loving embrace. I let my head rest against her shoulder, playing the bewildered patriarch to the last. She brought her mouth directly to my ear. Her breath was warm. Her voice was not. "Don't fight it, Dad." She whispered the words, slicing through the air like a blade. "You lost. We're in charge now. Just go quietly, and maybe I'll put you in one of the nicer facilities." She pulled back, pressed a soft kiss to my cheek, and released another loud, dramatic sob for the benefit of the social workers. I held her gaze, keeping my hands trembling, giving her the satisfaction of believing I was terrified. She turned and walked back to Clifton, burying her face against his chest. The deputies guided me gently up the steps and into the back of the transport van. The heavy metal doors slammed shut behind me, and the compartment dropped into a dim, sterile half-light. I heard the lock engage from the outside. The engine growled to life, and the van began rolling slowly down the long, dirt driveway, carrying me away from the only home I had known for 30 years. I sat on the hard plastic bench and listened to the steady hum of tires on asphalt. As the initial shock of the ambush began to loosen its grip, a dark, suffocating realization settled over me. The bitter irony of my situation was almost too heavy to hold. I closed my eyes and let my mind travel back exactly 25 years. At the height of my years in the federal prosecutor's office, I had been appointed to a special state commission tasked with rewriting the very conservatorship laws that were now being used to strip me of my freedom. There had been an epidemic of financial predators preying on vulnerable seniors, and the existing statutes offered them almost no protection. I had spent countless late nights at my mahogany desk, combing through legal precedents, drafting airtight provisions designed to freeze assets the moment severe cognitive decline could be demonstrated. I was the one who had drafted that specific emergency ex parte loophole. I had personally engineered the strict legal mechanism, the one that allowed social services to sidestep standard courtroom delays whenever two neurologists filed sworn affidavits, proving an immediate threat to a vulnerable patient. I had championed that law. I had stood before the state legislature and argued with everything I had that rapid intervention was the only way to protect victims before their estates could be picked clean by predators. It was widely regarded as my legal masterpiece, a shield forged for the defenseless. And now my own daughter had turned my masterpiece into a weapon, using the exact framework I had built to orchestrate a perfect crime. She had weaponized my own words, my own statutes, my own legacy, and used them to lock me away. The very people I had designed those protections for were now the ones escorting me to a locked psychiatric ward. Her legal maneuver was brilliant, no question, but it rested entirely on absolute fraud. The medical records were forged. The symptoms had been chemically induced. The whole narrative was a fabrication from start to finish. They had turned the law against its own architect, but they had made one fatal error. They assumed that by pulling me from Garrison's farm and confiscating my primary phone, they had cut off my ability to fight back. They thought it was over. They had no idea about the hidden cameras recording every corner of my study. They didn't know that Conrad Holloway was sitting in his downtown office with digital copies of their shadow banking debts and the footage of Clifton Aldridge going into my safe. And most critically, they had no idea about the small plastic burner phone tucked securely against my chest. I eased my right hand inside the thick wool of my cardigan and traced the rectangular outline of the device with my thumb. The van lurched over a pothole, jolting me slightly, but I stayed perfectly still on the bench. I didn't need to make a call yet. What I needed was to survive the mandatory psychiatric evaluation. I knew precisely how those evaluations worked. The questions the doctors would ask, the cognitive tests they'd administer, the specific behavioral markers they'd be watching for. Once the last of those harsh antipsychotics had cleared my system, my mind would be sharp as a scalpel. I would pass every test without a stumble. I would establish my mental competence beyond any doubt, and the moment I had a secure room to myself, I would pull out the burner phone and give Conrad the signal to drop the hammer. Lynette and Clifton were convinced they had successfully imprisoned me. They had absolutely no idea they had handed me the perfect legal alibi while my final trap was already snapping shut around their greedy throats. They had absolutely no idea they had handed me the perfect legal alibi while my final trap was already snapping shut around their greedy throats. The ride in that transport van felt like a slow descent into clinical purgatory. When we reached the high-security behavioral health facility on the outskirts of the county, I offered no resistance whatsoever. I understood that any flash of anger, any assertion of my legal rights, any demand to speak with an attorney would be logged immediately as combative paranoia. So instead, I let my shoulders cave. I shuffled across the linoleum floors. I fixed my gaze blankly on the intake nurses, offering only muddled murmurs when they asked for basic information. They cataloged my confiscated belongings, recorded my vitals, and walked me down a long, sterile corridor to a private room. The heavy door clicked shut, the electronic lock engaging with a solid, echoing thud. Through the narrow, reinforced glass panel set into the center of the door, I could make out a burly orderly taking up his post in the hallway. I was officially a ward of the state, a prisoner inside a system I had helped design. The room had been deliberately stripped bare, a narrow bed bolted to the floor, a single chair, and a small adjoining bathroom with no mirrors. I settled onto the edge of the stiff mattress and listened to the orderly's heavy footsteps outside. I waited through 2 agonizing hours, letting the initial intake rounds run their full course. I tracked the shifting rhythms of the facility until a deep quiet settled over the wing. Once I was confident I wasn't being actively watched, I slipped my hand into the deep pocket of my cardigan. My fingers closed around the burner phone. Moving with agonizing slowness, I drew it out and tucked it beneath the thin mattress, a secure hiding spot ready in case a nurse decided to sweep the room. I sat without moving, eyes locked on the door. The orderly had stopped pacing and appeared to be reading a magazine. I reached back under the mattress and retrieved the phone. I kept it low shielded against my body and dialed the screen brightness down to its lowest setting. The walls were thin, even a whisper could carry to the staff. I typed a quick text to Conrad Holloway. I gave him the name of the facility and laid out the ex parte emergency order, the forged medical affidavit, and the rapid extraction from Garrison's farm. His reply came back in 30 seconds. The message was brief, but the fury packed into it was unmistakable. They bypassed the standard docket, he wrote. They exploited that specific emergency loophole to strip your rights without a preliminary hearing. But the order is only temporary. The law requires a formal evidentiary hearing within 72 hours to solidify the conservatorship and make it permanent. That gives us exactly 3 days. I stared at the glowing screen, my legal mind shifting instantly into overdrive. 72 hours. It was a narrow window, but it was enough. I typed out my response, laying down the parameters of our counterattack. We let them believe they've already won, I wrote. No immediate motions contesting the hold. Don't tip off their legal team. Let them walk into that courtroom Monday morning convinced I'm completely defenseless. Conrad replied instantly. My forensic accountants have officially broken through the shadow corporate layers. We have the paper trail connecting his venture capital firm directly to the Chicago syndicate. We have the loan guarantees carrying your forged signature. My technical team has fully preserved the high-definition surveillance footage of Clifton opening your floor safe and photographing your assets. It is completely irrefutable. We will bury them. I read his words and felt a surge of cold, methodical satisfaction wash through me. Every piece of their fraud had to be exposed at the same moment simultaneously. I instructed Conrad to silently subpoena the two out-of-state neurologists who had signed the fabricated medical affidavits. We both understood those doctors had almost certainly been bought with syndicate money, and facing federal perjury charges, they would fold instantly on the witness stand. I also directed him to have a massive federal injunction prepared ready to be filed the second the hearing opened. We were going to hit them with a wave of legal destruction so total they wouldn't even have time to process it. Conrad agreed to the strategy. His final message carried a stark warning. You have to play your part flawlessly, Garrison. The doctors at that facility are going to evaluate you. They will try to provoke a reaction. Lynette will undoubtedly come to see you to build a record of your cognitive decline. You cannot break character. If they suspect for even a moment that your mind is sharp, they could panic and alert the syndicate to move on Garrison's farm before the hearing. I'll be the perfect broken old man, I typed back. I'll see you in court. I powered down this burner phone and worked it back into its hiding place deep inside the mattress. I stretched out on the stiff bed and stared up at the sterile white ceiling tiles. The bitter irony of my situation settled over me again, but this time it didn't feel like defeat. It felt like a necessary crucible. I was a prisoner in a psychiatric ward, stripped of my identity, my property, my freedom. But inside my own mind, I was completely free, and I was holding a lit match to the powder keg they had built around themselves. The next 48 hours would be an absolute test of my endurance and my ability to perform. I took on a vacant, hollow stare. When the facility psychiatrists came to evaluate me, I responded to their questions with slow, deliberate confusion. I mixed up dates. I said I didn't know what city I was in. I asked for Nadine. I let my hands tremble, and I refused the bland cafeteria food, allowing my physical appearance to deteriorate until it matched the forged medical profile Lynette had constructed. The doctors took careful notes, nodding with practiced sympathy, fully convinced they were witnessing a tragic case of rapid-onset dementia. Lynette visited on Sunday afternoon. She came into my small room with an orderly who carried a bouquet of cheap flowers. She wore a solemn expression, but her eyes were alive with absolute victory. She pulled the chair up beside my bed and spoke to me the way you'd speak to a small child. She told me not to worry about the farm, assuring me that Clifton was handling all the paperwork to keep everything in order. I looked up at her and let a thin line of saliva drift from the corner of my mouth, murmuring something shapeless and incoherent. She smiled that cold reptilian pull of the lips and patted my hand. Then she left, entirely certain her inheritance was already in the bag. She had no idea she had just walked into the final hours of her freedom. The trap was locked. Monday morning came in cold and gray, a relentless drizzle hanging over everything. The facility staff roused me just before dawn to get ready for the transport to the county courthouse. A stern orderly brought me a plastic bag containing a change of clothes that Lynette had supposedly packed and sent over from the farmhouse. It was a calculated insult. In place of one of my tailored suits, she had sent a faded plaid country shirt, a pair of worn denim trousers, and my scuffed leather work boots. She had even tucked in an old battered canvas hat I kept for gardening. The message could not have been clearer. She wanted me to walk into that courtroom looking exactly like a bewildered, unkempt farmer who had lost all grip on reality and basic self-care. I dressed slowly, letting my hands shake as I fumbled with each button on the shirt. I left my hair uncombed. The gray stubble on my jaw stayed untouched. When the transport deputies came to collect me, I shuffled along with my head down, clutching the worn hat tight against my chest. I was the very picture of a man who had already given up. The drive to the courthouse ran 45 minutes. I sat in the back of the transport van, watching the city blur past through the wire mesh window. My mind was running at full capacity, mapping every angle of the legal confrontation ahead. Conrad and I had coordinated our moves down to the last detail the night before. I knew exactly what part I had to play. The van rolled into the secure loading bay at the rear of the courthouse. The heavy doors swung open, and the freezing rain caught me full in the face. The deputies steered me up the concrete steps and through the stark institutional corridors of the holding area past cells and busy clerks toward the designated civil family courtrooms. Every step I took was deliberate. I dragged my left boot slightly, a subtle imitation of the physical deterioration Lynette had described in her fraudulent medical filings. We came at last to the heavy wooden doors of Courtroom 4. The deputy pushed them open, and a hush dropped over the room the moment we stepped inside. I kept my eyes fixed on the polished floorboards, but my peripheral vision was absorbing everything. The courtroom was sparsely filled standard for closed conservatorship hearings. Seated at the plaintiff table was Lynette, dressed in a conservative dark navy suit that broadcast a responsible daughter in every stitch. Beside her sat Clifton Aldridge in a tailored charcoal suit, wearing an expression of deep, practiced somberness. They had brought in a high-powered litigator from a prestigious city firm, a tall man with slicked-back hair and an expensive silk tie. I was guided to the defense table. I dropped into the seat heavily and set my worn hat on the table in front of me. I let my shoulders fold forward, my chin sagging toward my chest. I allowed myself one brief upward glance. Lynette was watching me. A subtle, incredibly cruel smirk tugged at the very corners of her mouth, the look of a predator watching a trapped animal take its final breath. Clifton leaned over and murmured something in her ear, shaking his head in a show of hollow, patronizing pity. They were absolutely convinced they had pulled off the perfect crime. The bailiff announced the arrival of the judge. The room rose to its feet, everyone except me. I stayed in my seat, performing the role of a man too far gone to recognize basic courtroom protocol. The deputy at my back gave my shoulder a gentle nudge, but I responded with nothing more than a rattling, confused exhale. The judge, a sharp-eyed woman with graying hair and precise glasses, settled into the elevated bench. She looked down at me with professional detachment, edged with quiet sympathy. The high-priced lawyer at Lynette's side launched immediately into his opening statement, speaking with the smooth, polished rhythm of a man accustomed to winning without opposition. "Your Honor." He began, his voice rolling through the hushed chamber. "We are here today under deeply tragic circumstances. We are petitioning the court to make the emergency conservatorship of Mr. Garrison Whitmore permanent." This was not a decision his family had arrived at easily, but it was one driven by absolute unavoidable necessity for his own physical and financial safety. The lawyer lifted a thick binder from the table and held it up for the judge. He proceeded to lay out what he clearly believed was an airtight case of severe, irreversible dementia. He walked the judge through the forged medical records with clinical precision, citing the sworn affidavit from the two out-of-state neurologists that documented a rapid and aggressive cognitive collapse. He read aloud passages describing my supposed symptoms, the violent paranoia, the failure to recognize my own family, the complete erosion of short-term memory. He painted a masterful and devastating portrait of a man whose mind had crumbled into a dark, terrifying void. I sat through every word without moving a single muscle, my eyes trained on the scuffed toes of my work boots. The lawyer then shifted to the financial dimensions of the estate. He laid out the vast acreage of Garrison's farm and the complex investment portfolios I had managed for years. Leaving such a substantial estate in the hands of a man gripped by severe delusions, he argued, was not merely irresponsible, it was actively dangerous. To drive that point home, the lawyer directed the court's attention to a large monitor positioned near the witness stand. He played the video Lynette had recorded on her cell phone the night of my manufactured crisis. The screen filled with the image of me standing barefoot in the freezing gravel, wearing thin pajamas, weeping and screaming for my deceased wife. The audio of my rambling filled the courtroom. It was deeply unsettling to watch myself in that condition. Even with full knowledge, it had been a calculated performance. The judge studied the screen, her expression gradually softening into profound sadness. The lawyer paused the footage, letting the image sit in the silence. As you can clearly see, Your Honor, my client's father is a serious danger to himself. He wanders out into freezing temperatures. He suffers from vivid hallucinations. He is entirely incapable of making sound decisions about his medical care or his considerable assets. We respectfully request that his daughter Lynette be granted full and permanent control over his estate to ensure his safety and preserve his legacy. The lawyer shut his heavy binder and stepped back, offering the judge a solemn, measured nod. Lynette reached over and softly squeezed Clifton's hand, then lifted a white tissue to dab a single meticulously manufactured tear from her cheek. The entire courtroom sat in complete silence. Everyone was waiting for me to react, to protest, to cry out in helpless bewilderment. I remained perfectly still in my wooden chair, head bowed, eyes locked on the floorboards. I let them soak in their false victory, biding my time, waiting for the final legal trap to snap permanently shut. The silence in courtroom 4 stretched through several long, agonizing moments. Judge Everett Strickland adjusted his heavy, dark-framed glasses and let out a quiet sigh. He looked down at the documents spread across the bench, organizing the forged medical affidavit and the fraudulent financial assessments into a neat stack. I could catch the faint rustle of paper as he readied himself to deliver his ruling. Lynette shifted in her seat across the aisle, the fabric of her expensive navy suit whispering against the polished wood of the plaintiff table. She produced another soft, manufactured sniffle, performing right to the very end. The high-priced litigator beside her cleared his throat and straightened his silk tie with an air of absolute confidence. He clearly believed he was closing out a routine, uncontested conservatorship hearing. Judge Strickland picked up his wooden gavel at last and cleared his throat to speak. Mr. Whitmore. Judge Strickland began, his voice carrying the gentle, practiced authority of a man trained to set confused minds at ease. I know this process can feel deeply disorienting and frightening. I need you to look at me, sir, so I can be certain you understand what is taking place in this courtroom today. I held my chin against my chest for 3 full seconds. I wanted the anticipation to build. I wanted Lynette and Clifton to feel the absolute peak of their false triumph before I tore it apart completely. Then slowly and deliberately, I raised my head. I let the slumped curve of my spine straighten. I pressed my palms flat against the defense table, cutting off the fabricated tremors in an instant. I lifted my eyes and locked them directly onto the man seated behind the elevated mahogany bench. The transformation that swept across Judge Everett Strickland was instantaneous and violently dramatic. The moment his gaze met mine, every trace of professional sympathy drained from his face. The color bled rapidly from his cheeks, leaving his skin the shade of old parchment. The heavy wooden gavel slipped from his trembling fingers and struck the sound block with a dull, hollow clatter that rang through the silent room. He physically recoiled in his high-backed leather chair, pressing himself into the upholstery, as though an electric current had shot straight up his spine. He lifted a shaking hand and pulled off his glasses, blinking rapidly, as if trying to dispel something impossible from his vision. His mouth fell open. No sound came out. The entire courtroom froze, completely bewildered by the sudden, terrifying shift in the presiding judge. My God! Judge Strickland whispered, his voice thin and breathless, carrying across the silent chamber without any need for a microphone. Is it really him? The slick litigator representing my daughter frowned in deep confusion. He stepped forward, both hands raised in a placating gesture. "Your Honor," the lawyer asked, his smooth cadence faltering for the very first time. "Is everything all right? Should we call a medical professional for the respondent?" Judge Strickland didn't acknowledge the lawyer at all. His eyes stayed fixed on my face, widening with a mixture of absolute shock, immense respect, and undisguised fear. He was not looking at a broken, unkempt farmer in a plaid shirt and scuffed boots. He was staring directly into the past. He was looking at the ghost of the man who had shaped his entire career. "Yes, Everett," I said. My voice was no longer frail or muddled. It filled the courtroom with the deep, commanding baritone I had honed over 30 years of prosecuting the most dangerous criminals in the state. "It has been a very long time." The sound of my true voice hit Lynette like a physical blow. I heard her gasp a sharp, ragged intake of air that gave away her panic instantly. Clifton stiffened in his chair, his posture snapping rigid as the confident smirk was wiped clean from his face. The high-priced lawyer swung his head back and forth between the judge and me, completely thrown by the sudden authority radiating from the man he had spent the last 20 minutes portraying as a helpless, delusional wreck. He opened his mouth to object, but Judge Strickland raised a trembling hand to silence him. "You are Garrison Whitmore," Judge Strickland said, leaning forward over the bench, abandoning every standard expectation of courtroom decorum. "You are the Garrison Whitmore." The lawyer practically lurched in his expensive shoes. "Yes, Your Honor," the lawyer cut in his voice, climbing with panic. "That is the respondent. We have thoroughly established his identity and his severe cognitive deterioration in the medical filings." Judge Strickland snapped his gaze toward the lawyer's eyes, burning with sudden concentrated fury. "Shut your mouth, counselor!" The judge barked, his voice cracking like thunder through the room. "You have absolutely no idea who is sitting at that defense table. 30 years ago, I was a struggling, desperate law intern. I made a terrible mistake that nearly ended my career before it had properly begun. That man right there stepped in, took me under his wing, and saved my professional life." The courtroom was suffocatingly quiet. Lynette was breathing in short, rapid bursts, her hands gripping the edge of the plaintiff table so hard her knuckles went a solid, bruised white. Clifton was staring at me with wide, terrified eyes, finally grasping that the helpless old man he had been drugging was an elaborately constructed illusion. Judge Strickland turned back toward me, his voice softening with profound reverence. "He is the most ruthless, brilliant, and honorable federal prosecutor this state has ever produced." The judge continued addressing the silent room, but speaking directly to my daughter's paralyzed attorney. "Chatiticha. He authored the very conservatorship statutes you are currently attempting to use in my courtroom today. He wrote the emergency ex parte provisions you filed on Friday morning. Are you seriously standing there telling me that the architect of this state's financial protection laws has lost his mind?" The slick litigator took a step backward, his professional composure in pieces. He stared down at his thick binder of forged records, then looked over at Lynette, his eyes demanding an explanation she was entirely incapable of providing. "Well, Your Honor," the lawyer stammered, his voice weak and uncertain, "we have sworn affidavits from 2 certified medical professionals." The judge's hand slammed flat against the surface of the bench. "I don't care what papers you have in that binder," Judge Strickland roared. "I know the man sitting in front of me. I know his mind." The energy in the room shifted so violently, the air itself felt heavy. I remained perfectly still, watching absolute terror take hold of my daughter and her husband. I had them exactly where I needed them. The stage was finally set for my ultimate revenge. The arrogant lawyer loosened his grip, letting the heavy binder crash to the polished floor. Lynette buried her face in her trembling hands, releasing a genuine, suffocating sob of pure defeat. The horrible truth landed on both of them simultaneously. The perfect crime was finished. I had won. I allowed the silence to hang there a moment longer, letting the full gravity of what was happening crush what remained of the air in their lungs. Then I slowly opened my fingers. The battered canvas hat fell from my grasp and landed on the polished floor with a soft, dismissive thud. I placed both hands flat on the defense table and pushed myself upright. The stooped, fragile posture I had maintained for weeks vanished in an instant. I rolled my shoulders back, raised my chin, and stood at my full height. The trembling in my hands was gone. My gaze hardened into the cold, penetrating stare that had once driven hardened criminals to break in interrogation rooms. I looked at opposing counsel, watching the arrogant litigator shrink back as if struck by something he couldn't see. The confident smirk that had been fixed to his face just minutes earlier dissolved into a mask of pure uncertainty. I turned my attention to the bench. "Your Honor," I said, my voice cutting through the stillness like a finely honed blade. "With the permission of the court, I am formally requesting to waive my right to appointed counsel. I will be representing myself in this matter." Judge Everett Strickland did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. "Permission is unequivocally granted, Mr. Whitmore," the judge replied, his voice thick with profound respect. "The floor is entirely yours." Right on cue, the heavy double doors at the rear of the courtroom swung open with a resounding crash. Conrad Holloway strode into the chamber, moving with the relentless momentum of an oncoming storm. He was dressed in his signature charcoal suit, radiating absolute authority. Behind him, two paralegals pushed a heavy metal trolley loaded with 6 large, tightly packed banker's boxes. The wheels squeaked sharply against the floorboards, splitting the quiet atmosphere of the room wide open. Conrad marched straight down the center aisle, completely ignoring the frantic, terrified stares of my daughter and her husband. He bypassed their table without a glance, without so much as a flicker of recognition in their direction, and wheeled the trolley directly alongside me. He gave me a single grim nod and stepped back. I rested my hand on the top box. "Your Honor," I continued, my tone ringing with absolute clarity, "the petition before this court today is not a tragic plea for the protection of a deteriorating patriarch. It is the final desperate act of a highly coordinated criminal conspiracy. The petitioners are attempting to use this courtroom to complete a $15 million fraud." I turned and looked directly at Clifton. His face was slick with cold sweat. He looked like a man standing on the gallows. I reached into the first box and pulled out a thick stack of printed transcripts and financial records. "Opposing counsel has presented you with sworn medical affidavits describing my supposed cognitive collapse," I said, moving slowly toward the center of the room. "He claims 2 independent neurologists diagnosed me with late-stage chemical dementia." I set the documents on the edge of the judge's bench. What counsel does not know is that my legal team served federal subpoenas on both of those out-of-state doctors yesterday evening. When faced with the threat of federal perjury charges and the immediate loss of their medical licenses, they became remarkably forthcoming. They confessed to accepting wire transfers of $50,000 each in exchange for signing those blank affidavits. I turned and looked at the slick litigator. The man appeared physically ill. He began frantically packing his briefcase, shaking his head in a desperate bid to distance himself from the wreckage now falling all around him. I did not stop. I reached into my pocket and produced a small, clear plastic evidence bag, holding it up for the room to see. Inside were the white capsules Lynette had been forcing on me. The symptoms described in those forged medical records were indeed real. I said, my voice dropping colder with every word. Because my daughter, the devoted petitioner, had been systematically poisoning me for the past 4 weeks, substituting my daily vitamin supplements with a dangerous, unprescribed regimen of antipsychotic medications specifically chosen to trigger severe tremors, lethargy, and temporary paranoia. She deployed a chemical restraint to manufacture exactly the visual evidence she required to strip away my autonomy. Lynette released a strangled, pitiful whimper and pressed her face deeper into her hands, but she was only half the picture. I shifted my full, withering focus onto Clifton. He tried to look away, but I moved closer to their table, leaving him no choice but to face me. The medical fraud was simply the key that opened the vault. I told the court, my voice rising toward the high ceiling. The true motive is seated right there at the plaintiff table. Clifton has projected the image of a highly successful venture capitalist. In reality, his firm is a bankrupt shell. He has not turned a profitable investment in 4 years. He currently owes $15 million to an illicit shadow banking syndicate operating out of Chicago, a violent organization that does not accept apologies for late payments. I walked back to the trolley and drew out a tablet, connecting it to the courtroom monitors. To save his own life, he needed collateral. He needed Garrison's farm, the acreage, the financial portfolios. When he couldn't persuade me to sign them over willingly, he stole the key to my floor safe. The courtroom screens flickered on. The crystal-clear, high-definition surveillance footage began to roll. Every eye in the room watched Clifton Aldridge creep into my study. They watched him peel back the antique Killam rugwork, open the hidden safe, and methodically photograph my private deeds and bearer bonds. The silence was total as the digital proof of his undeniable felony played out before the judge. He used those photographs to forge my signature on multiple loan guarantee documents. I stated, my voice cutting over the irrefutable video evidence. He pledged my entire estate to a criminal syndicate to cover his shadow debt. The emergency conservatorship filed on Friday was his last frantic move to finalize the legal transfer of those assets before I could deed Garrison's farm to a state charity. He was not protecting me. He was feeding me to the wolves to save himself. The arrogant litigator finally snapped his briefcase shut, abandoned his clients at the table, and literally sprinted for the heavy wooden doors at the rear of the chamber. He wanted absolutely no part of the enormous criminal conspiracy I had just methodically torn wide open. Lynette was hyperventilating, clawing at the collar of her expensive navy suit, unable to bear the crushing weight of her oncoming destruction. Clifton sat completely frozen in his chair, his eyes hollow and vacant, as he stared at the damning footage looping across the screens. They were utterly broken, trapped in a nightmare entirely of their own construction. I turned back to face the elevated bench, my gaze meeting Judge Everett Strickland's directly. I am not a helpless old man, Your Honor. I am Garrison Whitmore, and I am filing formal criminal charges against both of them in this courtroom today. I reached into the second banker's box Conrad had positioned beside me and withdrew a thick blue evidentiary folder. I opened it and pulled out a certified laboratory document, raising it so the judge could clearly read the embossed seal. Your Honor, I said, my voice steady and unwavering. The medical affidavit opposing counsel submitted relies on symptoms I did genuinely exhibit over the past month. However, those symptoms were not the product of cognitive decay. They were chemically induced. I am submitting into evidence a comprehensive independent toxicology report. 4 days before they removed me from my home, my attorney arranged for a covert blood and hair follicle analysis. The results conclusively establish a systematic daily ingestion of a powerful, unprescribed antipsychotic medication. I drew a secondary document from the folder, a crisp financial statement. Furthermore, I am submitting the corresponding financial trace. This is a certified credit card statement belonging to my daughter, Lynette Whitmore. It records a cash transaction at an out-of-state, unregulated pharmacy exactly 5 weeks ago. The purchase aligns perfectly with the precise dosage and timeline of the chemical restraints found in my bloodstream. She did not merely observe my mental decline. She engineered it, poisoning her own father to fabricate the medical grounds for this conservatorship. A collective gasp rippled through the sparse gallery. Lynette clutched at her throat, her chest heaving as she let out a piercing, high-pitched wail of absolute panic. The immaculate facade she had maintained for weeks was collapsing into dust right before my eyes. She began to shake uncontrollably, her gaze darting around the room as if hunting for a hidden exit. I did not pause to let them recover. I reached into the third box and lifted out a portable, high-capacity digital drive. I handed it to the bailiff, who formally presented it to the bench. This drive contains the raw, unedited 4K high-resolution footage captured by the concealed cameras in my private study. I explained, my tone turning razor-sharp. Opposing counsel briefly viewed one segment of this recording, but the full time-stamped file is now officially entered into the permanent court record. It shows Clifton systematically bypassing my security measures. You can clearly see him using specialized tools to crack the analog combination dial of my floor safe. The visual clarity is so precise you can read the serial numbers on the bearer bonds he is photographing. Clifton was trembling violently. The tailored charcoal suit that had looked so commanding on him earlier now appeared to hang off his shrinking frame. He opened his mouth, stammering disconnected syllables, desperately reaching for some lie that might account for the crystal-clear digital evidence of his burglary. But there was none. He had been caught in the act, invading my private sanctuary, stealing the very financial instruments he had claimed to want to protect. His hands clamped onto the edge of the table knuckles, going a stark, bruised white under the crushing pressure of that moment. Before Clifton could piece together a coherent word, I drew the final and most devastating piece of evidence from the boxes. I slammed a heavy stack of forensic accounting audits onto the defense table. The sound cracked through the silent courtroom like a gunshot. The burglary was not an isolated incident, I announced to the paralyzed room. I am submitting the complete, unredacted financial trace of Clifton's venture capital firm. These documents, verified by 3 independent forensic auditors, expose a massive hidden shadow debt. He owes $15 million to an illicit syndicate, a debt that has been accumulating compounding interest for 4 years. I raised a series of legal contracts, their pages flagged with bright red evidentiary tags. To satisfy the demands of his violent creditors, Clifton needed collateral. He needed Garrison's farm, my liquid assets, my entire estate. I am submitting these loan guarantee documents which bear my forged signature. Clifton used the photographs he took from my safe to construct a perfect replica of my legal authorization. He pledged everything I have spent my entire life building to cover his own reckless criminal gambling. The emergency ex parte order they filed on Friday was their absolute last resort to push through the legal transfer of my estate before the syndicate tore them apart. They needed me declared legally incompetent, so I could not challenge the fraudulent transfers that were scheduled to execute this very afternoon. Judge Everett Strickland stared at the mountain of undeniable proof laid out before him. His expression shifted from profound shock into a mask of pure, righteous, judicial fury. He looked down at the plaintiff table, his eyes burning with a contempt so deep it seemed to pull the warmth from the room. Lynette was screaming now, a continuous, hysterical torrent of denials and frantic apologies that washed over the steady sound of rain against the courtroom windows. She clawed at her husband's arm, begging him to undo the catastrophe they had walked headlong into. Her perfectly styled hair was a disheveled wreck, her expensive suit creasing and twisting as she writhed against the reality of her impending incarceration. She looked exactly like the terrified, cornered animal she had believed me to be just minutes before. Clifton did not look at his wife. He looked at the heavy wooden doors at the rear of the courtroom. The primal animalistic instinct to survive abruptly overrode every last fragment of rational thought in his mind. He shoved Lynette aside with force, sending her chair lurching backward with a violent, indifferent thrust. She crumpled onto the polished floorboards in a tangle of navy fabric, and terrified sobs, her arms reaching out into empty air. Clifton vaulted over the plaintiff table and tore down the center aisle toward the exit, sprinting for his life. Completely blinded by adrenaline, desperate to outrun the crushing reality of federal prison and the violent syndicate waiting for their money outside. He didn't even make it halfway down the long aisle. Judge Strickland brought the gavel down hard, the crack ringing out like a thunderclap beneath the vaulted ceiling. "Bailiffs, secure that man immediately." The judge's voice commanded absolute obedience from every officer in the room. 3 heavily armed bailiffs converged on Clifton, moving with swift, practiced tactical precision. The largest officer caught him from the side with a punishing shoulder tackle, driving him hard into the solid oak of the spectator benches. The impact expelled the wind from Clifton's lungs with a sickening thud. He hit the polished floor and thrashed wildly, kicking in blind, desperate panic. But the officers were utterly relentless. They wrenched his arms behind his back, pressing his cheek firmly against the cold floor. The sharp, unmistakable ratchet of steel handcuffs, snapping shut, echoed through the chamber, sealing his absolute, inescapable ruin. The trap had not merely closed, it had crushed them completely. I stood tall behind the defense table, watching my treacherous daughter weep uncontrollably on the floor, while her husband lay subdued and broken. The law I had devoted my entire life to defending had delivered its ultimate merciless verdict upon the architects of my suffering. Judge Everett Strickland did not hesitate for a single moment. The silence in the courtroom was so deep, I could hear rain hammering the tall glass windows, washing away the tension that had smothered me for weeks. He glanced toward the prosecuting attorney, who was still attempting to nudge his expensive briefcase quietly toward the center aisle, desperate to put distance between himself and the toxic fallout from his clients. Judge Strickland raised his hand and leveled a stern finger toward the bench. He announced that the emergency ex parte conservatorship was hereby entirely revoked, declared null and void from the very moment of its fraudulent inception. He stated that the court recognized me as being in full possession of my mental faculties, my autonomy, and all my legal rights. But he did not stop there. He ordered the remaining bailiffs to seal the doors and issued bench warrants on the spot for the arrest of both Lynette Whitmore and Clifton Aldridge. The charges he recited rang through the chamber like a requiem: severe elder abuse, willful and premeditated fraud, forgery of financial instruments, and most damning of all, the attempted poisoning and chemical imprisonment of a vulnerable senior citizen. The judge directed the district attorney to freeze every asset tied to Clifton and his shell venture capital firm. The trap I had laid in the quiet of my psychiatric room had fully sprung, catching them entirely off guard. The courtroom erupted into frantic, desperate motion. Additional deputies poured through the double doors in response to the judge's immediate call for backup. 2 officers hauled Clifton up from the floorboards, dragging him by his cuffed arms as he continued to thrash and sputter incoherent pleas. His expensive charcoal suit was torn at the shoulder and dusted with courtroom grime, a fitting image of the life he had destroyed. Lynette realized she was next. She tried to rise, her legs buckling beneath her. As the reality of federal prison crystallized before her eyes, a female deputy stepped forward and instructed her to place her hands behind her back. Lynette resisted, weeping hysterically, shaking her head over and over as the cold steel bracelets clicked tight around her slender wrists. She turned her desperate gaze toward me, mascara running in dark streaks down her pale cheeks. She opened her mouth to scream, but the deputies were already marching her toward the side exit and the holding cells beyond. Conrad Holloway stood beside me, arms folded across his chest, watching the systematic dismantling of the people who had tried to steal my life. We exchanged a single silent nod of mutual respect. The job was not just done. It had been executed with absolute terrifying perfection. I walked out of that courtroom with my spine straight and my mind sharper than it had felt in years. The heavy wooden doors swung shut behind me, muffling the chaos of the chamber. The corridor was cold and sterile, marble walls flickering fluorescent light. I spotted the deputies guiding Lynette toward the main transport elevator. The moment she saw me step into the hallway, a fresh wave of frantic energy overtook her. She fought against the officer's grip with everything she had left, throwing her body forward and dropping heavily to her knees on the hard marble floor directly in my path. The deputies tried to lift her, but she went entirely limp, wrapping her handcuffed arms around my scuffed leather work boots and sobbing a raw, guttural sound of sheer panic and utter defeat. "Dad, please!" she screamed, her voice bouncing off the long, empty corridor. "You have to stop this. You cannot let them take me away. I am your daughter. I am your blood. Please, I am begging you." I looked down at the woman weeping at my feet. I saw the same face I had kissed when she was a child, the same eyes that had smiled at me across the dinner table for 30 years. But I also saw the woman who had dissolved unprescribed antipsychotic pills into my evening tea. I saw the predator who had leaned close and whispered cruel, triumphant words into my ear as I was loaded into the back of a psychiatric transport van. I felt absolutely no pity. My heart was a stone fortress, completely sealed against the tears of a traitor. I did not kneel to comfort her. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with a quiet, lethal calm that cut straight through her hysterical wails. "You bled that out of yourself the day you put poison in my cup." I said, my voice steady and emptied of anything resembling warmth. I stepped back, pulling my scuffed boots free from her grasp. I turned my back on her and walked away down the corridor, the steady rhythm of my footsteps echoing against the marble. I did not look back, not even once, as her screams faded behind the heavy steel doors of the transport elevator. The justice system moved with remarkable speed when driven by irrefutable evidence and the righteous fury of an outraged judge. Within 6 months, the legal proceedings concluded with devastating finality. Clifton Aldridge was found guilty on multiple federal charges of wire fraud, grand larceny, and conspiracy. The shadow banking syndicate he was indebted to was simultaneously dismantled by federal authorities using the forensic accounting trails Conrad Holloway had painstakingly assembled. Clifton was sentenced to 15 consecutive years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. He lost his firm, his reputation, and his freedom, exchanging his tailored suits for standard institutional orange. Lynette faced an equally severe reckoning. The medical fraud and elder abuse charges shredded her pristine social standing and her accumulated wealth. She lost any license to conduct business management in the state. She received a lengthy sentence in a state correctional facility entirely cut off from the luxury and privilege she had betrayed her own father to secure. Their greed had been their absolute undoing, a poison far more lethal than anything they had slipped into my drink. With my enemies behind bars, I returned to the sanctuary of Garrison's farm. I worked closely with Conrad Holloway to establish a massive bulletproof legal trust. I transferred the bulk of my financial portfolio and the deed to the farm into this protected entity specifically designed to fund legal defenses and protective services for vulnerable senior citizens caught in abusive conservatorships. I made certain that the very laws I had written could never again be turned against the innocent. It was a crisp morning in early November. The sun was just beginning to crest the rolling hills of the property, throwing long golden shadows across the frost-covered grass. I stepped out onto the wooden planks of my back porch, a steaming cast-iron mug of black coffee warming my hands. The farm was completely quiet save for the chirping of the morning birds. I stood there alone, breathing in the cold air finally, and completely at peace. Betrayal often wears the familiar face of those we trust the most, hiding greed behind a manufactured mask of false concern. We spend our lives building a legacy to protect our children only to discover that true security does not rest in the wealth we accumulate, but in the firm boundaries we have the courage to enforce. If you have stayed with me all the way to this moment, I want to say thank you, truly. This story asked a lot of you, and you gave it your full attention. Looking back on everything, Garrison walked through the poisoned tea, the locked ward, the courtroom where his own laws were turned against him. What strikes me most is not the victory. It is the cost. Weeks of pretending to be broken. Weeks of watching people who called themselves family treat him like an inconvenience. I believe God allows certain trials not to destroy us, but to reveal exactly how much we are still capable of. And sometimes the proof of who we really are only comes out when everything has been stripped away. Here is what this story taught me, and what I hope it leaves with you. Do not sign anything under pressure. If someone is rushing you toward a legal decision, that urgency is almost always working in their interest, not yours. Document your life before trouble arrives. Cameras written records a trusted attorney. These are not signs of paranoia. They are the quiet armor of a prepared mind. If you feel confused or foggy and cannot explain why, ask a doctor you chose yourself. Garrison's clarity was stolen one small capsule at a time. And when someone shows you contempt disguised as concern, believe what you see, not what they say. If this story stirred something in you, share it with someone who might need to hear it today. Leave a comment and tell me what moment hit you hardest. And if you are not already part of this community, subscribe to Dad Revenge so you never miss what comes next. Thank you for listening. Take care of yourself out there, and I will see you in the next one.